So we'll go ahead and call the meeting to order. I have a roll call of the members.
Scott Spears.
Here.
William Cheever. William,
Yeah, it's muted, sorry.
Okay.
I'm here.
Fong Lee.
I'm here.
Debbie Pearson.
Here.
Peter Kazura.
Here.
Matthew Pricero.
And Matthew said that he would be joining us late due to an emergency this morning. So we'll move to the approval of minutes of May 21st, 2020. I want to make sure that everybody received and reviewed the revised minutes. Any comments, questions, corrections?
None.
Hearing none, that I move that we approve the minutes as revised of May 21st, 2020. William?
Aye.
Pete?
Aye.
Fong?
Aye.
Scott?
Aye.
Thank you. Minutes are approved. We will move to the application of DA 2020-0053, Grandview Station, 7318 West 57th Avenue, 7317 and 7315 Grandview Avenue. We'll begin with the staff presentation.
Right.
Oh, you know what? I jumped ahead. I apologize.
That's okay.
I did. I wasn't reading the screen and I forgot my notes. I do want to explain the purpose of the committee. The role of the Design Review Advisory Committee is to review requests for land use activities within the Old Town Zoning District for compliance with the design guidelines for Old Town Arvada and to make recommendations to the Director of Community Development regarding this compliance or appropriate waivers. The committee also acts as an advisory resource for applicants desiring preliminary input on design proposals and provides input for the content of the design guidelines and associated zoning regulations as needed. So once again, this is an advisory committee that is strictly looking at the design guidelines themselves, nothing else. Now we'll go ahead and start with the staff.
Thanks, Debbie. The Grandview Station Certificate of Compliance with Old Town Design Guidelines application includes the demolition of 3 contributing structures to the Arvada Downtown Historic District located at 7315 and 7317 Grandview Avenue and 7318 West 57th Avenue, 1 non-contributing accessory structure, and the construction of a new 3-story mixed-use building. The contributing structure at 7315 Grandview Avenue is a 1-story single-family form built in 1909 and features a side-gabled roof and central gable above the entrance. The front facade contains double-hung windows with a narrow and wood surrounds. 7317 Grandview Avenue is also a 1-story dwelling featuring a pyramidal hipped roof frame that was also built in 1909. An original brick chimney has been removed and a flat addition was built on the north elevation. Windows facing the porch are sash and transom with windows on windows on the side elevations are double hung rather. A non-original enclosed porch is also located on the front facade. Lastly, 7318 West 57th Avenue features another 1-story dwelling with gabled roof and walls and roof clad with corrugated metal and was built in 1924. The structure may have been originally built as an outbuilding that was converted into a residence. All 3 of these contributing structures represent the vernacular residential architecture common to the late 19th and early 20th centuries within Old Town and Reno Park as well. A variance from the Arvada Land Development Code was approved on February 25th, 2019 by the Board of Adjustment to allow the construction of a 3rd-story building when the LDC only allows a 2-story building. As such, the proposed mixed-use building includes a total of 3 stories, with the ground floor along Grandview Avenue dedicated to approximately 11,378 square feet of commercial and retail space, and the ground floor along West 57th Avenue providing vehicular access to a parking garage containing 20 parking spaces, as well as bicycle parking and a trash collection area. The second and third floors contain a total of 14 14 residential for sale condominiums with private balconies for each unit. The second and third floors are both set back from Grandview Avenue, thus minimizing the perceived mass of the building from the pedestrian realm on Grandview. A portion of the third story on West 57th Avenue is stepped back, while the majority of the building is built at the sidewalk edge as envisioned by the Old Town Design Guidelines. The building is clad with a combination of full bed and thin bed brick, precast masonry units, and cement board. The facade facing Grandview is completely clad in brick, including the use of brick columns, parapet caps, and brick patterns located above the storefront. Precast masonry units are utilized as kick plates along the base of the building. Red fabric awnings are used on the ground floor, and decorative steel lintels are used above both commercial and residential windows. The West 57th Avenue ground floor mirrors that of the Grandview facade, with brick as the primary material and precast masonry units as the base. An overhead door made of steel and glass is used to access the parking garage and trash collection area. Red fabric awnings and decorative steel lintels are also a prominent architectural detail on this facade. A portion of the residential facade on the second and third floors utilizes cement board as the primary material. Both east and west sides of the building utilize a combination of brick, cement board, and concrete block. Based on staff's analysis of the application, the following partial waivers are recommended. Guideline 5.26 window spacing pattern, in order to allow the second and third floors on the Grandview facade to maintain a more modern solid to void ratio in order to allow the residential units more sunlight and outdoor access. Guideline 5.28 storefront components, in order to allow the roll-up garage door with the metal frame and glass windows on the West 57th Avenue facade. Without alley access, the only way to access the parking garage is from a public street. Vehicular access off of West 57th Avenue is preferable as compared to the Grandview Avenue side. And finally, demolition criteria 8.6, context and design for the removal of the 2 historic contributing single-family form structures along Grandview Avenue, which would affect the relationship of the single-family home on the adjacent property to the west, the Eli Ashby house. Currently, these 3 residential forms together are set back from the street, resulting in a different relationship to the street than the rest of the buildings on Grandview Avenue within this block and within the district. The new building would relate to the other mixed-use buildings along Grandview and West 57th Avenue, however. As described in the staff report, staff believes that all 3 partial waivers have been justified and are reasonable to grant without negatively affecting the historic district. And at this time, staff will turn the time over to the applicant for their presentation.
Keen's first, right?
Hi, can everybody hear me okay? Yes. Okay, thumbs up. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to give a brief background on how we got to where we are today, and then I'm going to turn it over to our project architect, John Matthews, to go through how the project complies with the design guidelines. Next slide, please. So a little bit of project history. We were introduced to the owners of these properties about 6 years ago, and the properties appeared to be in disrepair. But the first thing we did after we put them under contract is that we hired engineering firms to conduct basically structural analysis of the properties. And you have those in your packet. The results came back conclusive that the properties were in a state of disrepair, and the cost to convert them to a commercial application and bring everything up to code would be cost prohibitive. At that time, we brought in a qualified general contractor, and they also gave a price estimate based on the the actual scope of the project and current, market labor and materials. And again, it confirmed what the engineering report said, that to bring these properties back up to code for a commercial application was cost prohibitive. So at that time, we started asking ourselves, well, if these properties aren't to remain as they are, what should be in this place? And we didn't design this project, and we designed the project, but the actual mixed-use building was driven by a number of conversations with neighbors, business owners, Old Town advocacy groups, several council members. We went out and we actually went and knocked on doors probably back in late 2014 in Old Town with pictures of what we thought should go there, and got a lot of feedback and had a lot of meetings. At the same time, we studied all of the governing documents and advisory documents for redevelopment in this sub-district, and came up with a basic plan that's not unlike what you're looking at today. In 2015, we ended up closing on 7317 Grandview, and we're in and out of contract with the other properties for much of 2015, and then we fell out of contract. And 7315 Grandview and 7318 West 57th were actually listed on the MLS for about 18 months through 2016 and 2017. And during that time, no parties that we know of came forward with a viable project to restore these properties. I know there were some conversations with some various entities and some pre-apps with the city for different development ideas. But ultimately, none of that came to fruition. Nobody closed on the properties clearly that were publicly listed. And I don't think anybody actually put the properties under contract. So they sat there for a couple of years, continuing their state of disrepair. And then finally, at the end of 2018, we came in and purchased the adjacent properties to kind of, square off the development area. And in January, and then we started our formal development application. In January 2019, we invited 250 neighbors to a neighborhood meeting. This wasn't a requirement as an administrative track, but again, going back 4 or 5 years, it was important that we told the community what we were planning and get feedback. And we were very upfront about that from the beginning. In February of 2019, we did appear before the Board of Adjustments, and we received unanimous support for the stepped back third story that, again, is within the allowable size of the building envelope. It was just redistributing the allowable space over 3 stories versus 2 to allow for a mixed use with residential application. During the spring and summer of 2019, we went through 3 full reviews with city staff. In August of 2019, we received unanimous support with partial waivers from this committee. And then in November 2019, we received unanimous support from the City Planning Commission. Next slide. So going back to 2014, when we hired these engineering firms to tell us what the inside of the properties looked like, you all have these reports in your packets, but I just want to point out a couple of things. So regarding 7317 Grandview, the property was not adequately maintained and is overall in poor condition. There was severe deterioration and damage to the foundation and the east center structure, where a portion of the foundation walls actually collapsed, and you see that image up on the screen. And in their opinion, and of course we agreed with that, and our contractors agreed with that, is the cost to upgrade this structure to meet current codes would be cost prohibitive. 7315 Grandview, much of the same. The brick foundation was crumbling. All the mortar was missing. There was really no permanent foundation underneath the living space, just a bunch of kind of 2x4s propping it up. And the floor framing was inadequate, and much similar with 7318 West 57th. The roof, siding, structural damage, you name it, it was bad. So according to the design guidelines, for a property to be historically significant, it must retain sufficient integrity to be able to convey that significance. And the guidelines go on to say that a majority of the building's structural systems should remain intact. It wasn't us who said it, it was the engineers who said that structural systems were not intact, and therefore we believe that a long time before we got involved, these properties lost their historical significance. Next slide, please. So as I said, when we were talking to neighbors and business owners, we were also studying the city documents that were put in place by council years ago on if these properties were to be redeveloped, what should go there. So we studied the Arvada comp plan, the section on the land use and redevelopment, and goal L3 states to encourage development of transit supportive, higher density, mixed use, pedestrian oriented, Goal L4 is to promote mixed-use transit-oriented development. Goal L5 was to designate and promote redevelopment and infill to generate economic revitalization, improve conditions, and provide an appropriate mix of quality housing choices. And keep in mind, these are for sale properties that we're building. These aren't rental properties. And this was our design from the beginning. Owners take care of their neighborhood. They pick up trash. They take care of their neighbors. That's the people that need to be living in Old Town versus renters, in our opinion. We studied the Arvada Transit Framework Plan. The TOD principles include an active 18-hour place, mix of uses, compact pedestrian-oriented design, moderate density, especially near transit. The Old Town Station Plan goals include providing a variety of employment, retail, housing within walking distance to transit. And then it also calls for more intensive uses in the character of Old Town. And then we also studied advisory studies, one of which being the Old Town Retail Advisory Study, which states that this location is within the only area in Grandview and Old Town without a street wall containing a continuous street wall containing retail, restaurants, office. It goes on to say that a continuous street wall contributes greatly to the success of a pedestrian-oriented street, and sections where there is a discontinuous street wall impacts retail continuity and character. We've talked to some people on the east end of Grandview, especially Ron and Bobby Stat, who own Breadwinners, and that always has been an issue, is that people kind of stop and think that the retail and services end before they reach their building because there is that discontinuous street wall. So that's a little bit of context. I, of course, will be answering questions, but I want to hand it over to John Matthews, the project architect, who will speak to how this project does comply with the design guidelines.
Thank you, Keen. I'm here with Brad Eichman, and our firm, MA Architects, has been working on the design of this project for more than 2 years. There's been a significant amount of time and effort put into the design of this project to ensure that, it would be an excellent addition to downtown Arvada and this block, specifically on Grandview. Can we go to slide 13? Yes, thank you. During this time, we've worked closely with the neighborhood representatives and the city staff to ensure that the proposed design meets or exceeds all of the design guidelines relating to this project. This is clearly demonstrated in the proposed design of the building, and the compliance analysis and staff report for this design review committee meeting clearly demonstrates, in fact, the new staff report and the attached design guidelines matrix indicates that this project, in fact, meets 70 of 73 design guidelines. Furthermore, all of this detailed information was presented and approved by both the design review committee previously, the Board of Adjustment, and the Planning Commission, all unanimously. So with that, I'd like to go into some specific elements of the architecture again and discuss some of these. I'm not going to go through every design guideline because it's clearly outlined in the staff report, but I am going to go through some of the ones that related to the original certificate of compliance that was issued and some of the partial waivers that were granted, because we feel that that's important to discuss those. Again, this project is a high-quality mixed-use building and reinforces the historical character of the Old Town Arvada district. I'd like to summarize the design guidelines for the Grandview area OTGV subdistrict and how this project meets or exceeds these goals. Number one, promote a mixed-use area that maintains the historic character of the street. This project provides a strong retail, one-story retail front along Grandview. Parking has been located in the rear of the project off of 57th, which, by the way, that building elevation, we'll get into that in a minute, that has been enhanced greatly since some of the previous presentations, and provides for sale housing on the second and third floors, condominium units. The Arvada comp plan states the city will encourage higher intensity mixed-use development that support rail and bus transit along designated corridors and transit stations. These for sale residential units on this project will contribute greatly to the vibrancy of Old Town. Next slide, please. Number 2, provide retail storefronts along the sidewalk edge. This reinforces the pedestrian experience and adds vibrancy to Grandview. By the way, the current break in the building frontages with the current historic homes was identified in the transit station framework plan as negatively affecting street activation. This rendering clearly shows the new retail, the architectural detailing with the precast base, the extensive brick detailing, steel beam headers, fabric canopies, the storefront, and you can see the step back parapet design there above the one-story retail portion. Next slide, please. Number 3, allow a mix of smaller courtyards linked to the sidewalk. This is a new rendering that we've added to the project that clearly shows our entry courtyard off of Grandview, the sidewalk on Grandview, and how we've created a nice inviting entrance into the apartment entrance to the project. So the retail turns the corner and you can see back into this entry courtyard. This project does combine a smaller courtyard and an entry plaza on the west for strong pedestrian connections. Next slide, please. Minimize the visual impacts of parking from the street. This is the new elevation that we're proposing for the 57th Street side. You can see this has been greatly enhanced. New storefront detailing, new fabric awnings, the same precast brick detailing that we have in the front of the building, and we've also stepped back the 3rd floor to relate to some other design guidelines for the project. Back to slide 14. Yes, retain one-story portions of buildings at the sidewalk edge for new infill. The retail building, the height to the parapet is 16 feet 6 inches along Grandview. This meets Arvada's land development code. Mixed use form does require, by the way, an 85% build to the front of the property line. Provide varied height on larger projects by including some one-story portions along the sidewalk. As you can see, the design of the building steps back from Grandview, and this greatly enhances the solar access for the property to the west and greatly reduces the apparent mass of the building from Grandview. I will show this in more detail with the solar studies later. Allow small mixed-use buildings on double-fronted lots that face 57th Street. This project is a direct response to this goal. Maintain low scale and varied height along the block. This project meets that goal as well. And go back to slide 13. Adds to the character of the historic district by complementing the existing early 20th century buildings without trying to recreate that era. So we are reinforcing the predominant use of brick. We have smaller scale details, projecting stone sills and cornice treatments, relates to historic modules and details on older buildings in the area, traditional facade design, a strong base, middle, and top. The building steps back, reducing the mass and scale while adding visual interest with the rooftop terraces, which add vibrancy to the street and the area. Substantially, all of the Old Town Arvada design guidelines have been met. I'd like to move on and talk specifically about the certificate of compliance that was issued to this project. So we should be going to slide 17. When the original project design review committee, when the design review committee approved the project and issued the certificate of compliance, there were some partial waivers that were granted. 4 4.1, minimize the impacts to primary views from existing private structures and public ways. The design has been carefully considered by stepping the building back to allow view and solar access. Please keep in mind that, again, because of this mixed-use building form, the design guidelines require an 85% build-to requirement. The code does allow for full height massing to the street. However, we've stepped the building back, as you can see in the rendering. 4.26, fixed metal canopy may be considered. The only metal canopy left on the project is at the primary residential entry. We believe that it is consistent with the overall architectural style of the new building, however, and we do feel that it's appropriate. 4.32, retain significant landscape features. Again, this should not be a waiver. As the landscape architect, city's landscape architect reviewed the existing trees on the site and determined that they were not character defining. 5.12, the step back design, which talks about maximize solar access for the adjacent properties. With this, I'd like to go to slide 18, talk a little bit about the shade studies that were completed for this project. The first one you see is on December 21st at 9 in the morning. And this is actually the time of year and the time of day that provides the most shading on the adjacent Eli Ashby house to the west. In fact, you can see that the front courtyard area and the front porch area is in full sun, and the only shading is on the eastern side of the Eli Ashby house. Next slide. This shows December 21st at noon. You can see the Eli Ashby house is in full sun. Again, because of the step back building design, you can see we are not impacting shading on the Eli Ashby house. Next slide, please. This goes to 3 p.m., which would be an afternoon condition on December 21st. Keep in mind, December 21st is when the sun angle is the lowest, so the shadows are the longest. In fact, the existing building to the west casts the most shadows on the Eli Ashby house. Next slide. I want to point out that per the allowable design guidelines and zoning regs, we could have built a 32-foot high structure, commercial structure, to the building frontage. And you can see what a greater impact that would have had on the Eli Ashby house had we not gone with the step back building design. Next slide, please. This shows a residential form meeting residential setbacks with a gabled roof. And you can see even that type of structure would have a greater impact on the Eli Ashby house to the west. So again, I wanted to go through these slides to clearly show how we really have taken great care to maximize solar access as much as possible for adjacent properties. Next slide, please. 5.19 talked about maintaining the traditional size of buildings as perceived at the street level. The size of the building in relation to the traditional size of buildings along Grandview clearly meets the traditional spacing patterns both in width. If you look at the building widths of the adjacent buildings to the west, our project clearly is in the same modules and massing, both vertical and horizontal, as other buildings on the block. This was carefully studied with the adjacent retail buildings. We can go to the next slide. We thought this was kind of an interesting slide, and this is a little bit of a, I'm kind of progressing onto something. This is an existing project on Old Wadsworth, and it clearly shows a large two-story commercial structure built out to the street edge, and an adjacent residential structure, and how in fact these two can work in concert together. Very similar. There's a large tree in the front, very similar to the Eli Ashby house. Clearly demonstrate that the precedent's already been established, and that this is clearly an example of how these projects can work in tandem. And then lastly, let's see, 5.22, position taller portions of the structure away from neighboring buildings. If we go to slide 24, okay, we're on 24. This is an example again of what's been done previously. But we have worked closely, if we go to slide 25, with the city staff, some of the improvements that have been made, we have stepped back the stair tower, stepped them down to minimize the impact on the adjacent home. And in addition, we have also, and I'll get to that in a minute, we greatly enhanced the design of the 57th Street elevation. 5.26 talked about maintaining this traditional spacing pattern created by the upper story. If you look at slide 27, which is the front building elevation, this building does meet the intent of this requirement, however, is a more contemporary interpretation to traditional spacing patterns. The design has been refined to meet the spirit of this intent. Please keep in mind, due to the residential units on the second and third floors, the windows have been enlarged slightly to maintain adequate light and ventilation to the units and to provide access to the outdoor patios. Okay, and then next slide. So in summary, I think we've clearly demonstrated that this building does in fact meet the spirit and the intent of the Old Town Arvada design guidelines with the historical, traditional facade styling, architectural fenestration and detailing, materials, predominant use of brick, color, and texture. We really believe this project's going to be a terrific addition to this area of Old Town. And in closing, again, I'd like to look at the next slide and talk about how this was the original elevation along 57th Street. And there were some comments received that this was not a true front elevation. So if you go to the next slide, this is our current proposed elevation on 57th Street. And you can see again how the stair tower has been lowered to meet the maximum height of the building. We've added extensive brick detailing, the same precast base, the architectural detailing with the brick and the brick columns, the spacing patterns, the storefront detailing. We've added glass to the garage door, steel beam headers, and then stepping back the third floor. So we feel like this is a significant improvement, and we've continued to improve this building to enhance its compatibility with the street and with this area of Old Town. So with that, that concludes my presentation. We'll be happy to answer any questions specifically about specific design guidelines. And with that, I'll turn it back over to the host.
Thank you. We will now move on to the adjacent landowner presentations, and they'll be allowed 30 minutes as well.
Good morning. My name is David Forster. Can you hear me okay? Can you see me? Can you hear me? Great, thank you. And we have a presentation as well. I'll wait until that comes up onto the screen to begin. That is not it. No one said it would be easy.
Yeah, we're working on it. Give us just a couple.
Oh, hey, this is our new universe.
Josie, which slide do you know?
It's in the same slideshow that you were just on. Yeah, keep going.
Is it? Oh, here we go.
Yeah, it'll be right after that. There you go.
Right. All right. And I'll just ask you to move the slides and somebody will just magically do that, I'm guessing. So thank you. First, let me begin by introducing myself. My name's David Foster. I'm a land use and property rights attorney, Foster, Graham, Milstein, and Kalisher, and I'm representing Lori Dranka today, as I have for the last nearly a year and a half relating to this project. So it is good to be here with you all this morning. Thank you for the time. If we can move on. What I don't think staff mentioned, and I am convinced that the applicant didn't, is why we're here. So let me remind you why we're here. The City Council actually denied this certificate in December, and that's why you are hearing this case again. And then the city was unable to have a rehearing because the Court of Appeals had made a determination that the city had read its code the wrong way. And so that's why this project has to start again with this process. So that's why we're here, because the City Council denied this certificate. I'm not going to tell any of you on this call that Old Town is a special place. You know that. You're volunteers, you work hard, you recognize how important this community is. It's important enough that it has its own design review process and criteria. And there are heightened standards for ownership and design within this district. And this is a statement that's in the responsibility of ownership is in the design guidelines for Old Town Arvada. And I know that you've read that over the years, and I wanted to put that on the screen. It takes a special developer to build in historic districts. I've been practicing representing developers for years and years. It takes a special developer to develop in a historic district. I don't think we have that developer in this particular instance, and we're going to walk through a series of reasons why that's the case. And so if we can move on to the next slide. These are the pictures from the last submittal on the left, 2019. And we just took these pictures just the other day, last week. And I know that there is going to be testimony a little bit later on about the condition of the properties just a few years ago. In fact, we had family living in one of the properties. So we have pictures of both interior and exterior of these sites, and we'll present that shortly. Next slide, please. Before you can approve a new project, you actually need to approve the demolition of existing structures. And what I think is a bit of a misnomer in this particular case is that we've been thinking about these in the aggregate. There are 4 buildings that are being demolished, 3 of which are contributing structures. It is the obligation of this board to consider each and every one of those demolition requests individually. It's not handled in the aggregate. This isn't an all or nothing proposition. That's a false choice that you've been given over the course of the past year. And when you see the importance of why you have design guidelines, it's to prevent the inappropriate alteration or demolition of historic resources. And further, you can see that there are criteria and standards. Demolition of historic buildings is strongly encouraged, and the criteria shall be used by the review authority in its deliberations. So first, you're the review authority in this particular instance in considering the demolition. Second, this is the public hearing that is referenced in the design guidelines. And you shall use the criteria to approve the demolition. That's why we have the criteria in the design guidelines. Next slide, please. And here you have the criteria for total demolition of a structure. And these are the overarching demolition criteria. And we don't get to talk about a new project until we talk about the demolition criteria. So you can see in A2 there that relevant information is presented at a public hearing. This is the public hearing. It's not a board of adjustment. It's not a neighborhood meeting. It's in front of this particular body where we have the conversation about demolition. And there are these 7 criteria that must be met in order to approve a demolition. Next slide, please. You have been working on historic Arvada and downtown and this district since 1998. And I would direct your attention, Deborah Andrews had made a submittal, a rather lengthy submittal, and I wanted to direct your attention to 3 letters from Deborah Andrews' packet. One is from History Colorado, dated December 13th, 2019. And in it, it states, the demolition or unsympathetic alteration of contributing buildings within a historic district erodes the integrity of the district and weakens its significance. If the integrity of a district continues to be compromised over time, it may reach a point where it can no longer convey its significance and may be removed from the National Register. Second letter, oh, I'm sorry, that was from History Colorado, signed by Timothy Stroh. Second letter is from Colorado Preservation, Inc., signed by Kim Grant. This process was and continues to be the key to the success of the Old Town area. Actions that endanger the integrity of the district, and in particular the core axis along both Old Wadsworth Boulevard and Grandview Avenue, threaten to undermine or overwhelm the success of the district, as has played out in other parts of the Denver metro area. The strength and uniqueness of the Arvada Downtown Historic District lies in the intermingling of building types and functions in the early city. And the third letter, dated November 5th, 2019, is from Jefferson County Historical Commission. And it states, in part, the Old Town Arvada Historic District is one of the most important such registrations in Colorado. It is now being challenged as a historic district by commercial interests. Several of the buildings in the historic district are slated for destruction and replacement by new structures, which would violate the intent of the original designation. And those are all in your packet for you to review at your leisure. The owners of these 4 properties actually signed the application back in 1998 when the district was created. And certainly the developer knew or should have known when he was purchasing these properties over the course of 5 years that there was going to be a heightened standard within this historic district. Next page, please. Continuing on, you have a comment there. We just put some snippets from different organizations within the city that were so proud in 1998 of the creation of this district. And you can see the top left, inclusion on the National Register of Historic Places will further encourage the awareness of the city's historical significance to Colorado. That was from the mayor and city council. Excited about the adoption of this district. Next page, please. And then here on this page, you can see the significant importance of Grandview. Grandview is held in a different standard. There are additional guidelines, as you know, in reference that deal with architectural design along Grandview. This is the axis, as was identified in Kim Grant's letter. Next page, please. In between 2010 and 2013, next page, please. Thanks. Between 2010 and 2013, the city was adopting these design guidelines. And what did the city do? The city invested money and hired a consultant to do so. They hired Norrie Winter to draft both the design guidelines and the zoning standards that would dictate how this property and these properties would ultimately develop. This was a considerable public investment in time, process, and money. Next page, please. A6 is a criteria that the staff doesn't believe that this project meets. Let's talk about this for a couple of minutes. And you can see where the questions are asked in this design review criteria. Would removal of this historic structure affect the relationship of similar buildings in the area? Is the new design proposed in its place compatible? So the staff says no. We don't meet this, and we're going to approve a waiver for this condition. But let's talk about why we don't meet this. First, it eliminates 2 of 3 residential buildings along Grandview, 2 contributing structures along Grandview. It, of course, impacts Ms. Trianka's home property, the Eli Ashby house, in a rather significant way. There's no disputing that. There is reference made to the Gen building on the corner. That's not in the Grandview district. Just for clarification, it's referenced a couple of times as being a project to be looked at as similar or consistent. It's not in the Grandview district. And so with the demolition of these structures, 3 of the 11 residential buildings in the downtown historic district will be demolished, removed forever. 3 of the contributing structures. When you look at the statement made by the city, they state, and it's the second paragraph on the right there, in its current state, the existing single-family homes do not relate to the other shop front and mixed-use buildings along Grandview. The continuous street wall along Grandview is broken wall between Weebelt Building and Breadwinners, where these homes exist. And in fact, I believe the architect representing the applicant was speaking to this. It's interesting to me that the criteria that is being used in this particular analysis is that it's almost better to remove historic structures, these residential buildings, in order to meet other design criteria that exist elsewhere within the district. That, to me, is probably the most strange to understand justification for building a new building while removing the old buildings. What represents the historic fabric of this neighborhood better than the existing historic structures? And so the staff agreed that this criteria is not met. They went on the next page to deal with the waiver criteria. So the waiver criteria is important. It's not just important for this particular element of the demolition. It's important because every single criteria that's not met must independently meet this waiver criteria. Every criteria not met must meet this waiver. Why is that important? It's important because if you were to just identify that a project meets a waiver, or one of the criteria meet the waiver, you can allow that waiver to satisfy any of the criteria under that circumstance. That is not what the intent of this code is. Each time an applicant is trying, or the city is trying, to have a criteria waived, it must meet this criteria. So what is this criteria? It's economic hardship, strict compliance with the design guidelines. The city and the developer are analyzing this question in the aggregate, not in a building by building, structure by structure analysis. They are doing it in the aggregate. And Karen Miller will be speaking to this issue a little bit more in her public comments. But what we don't have in this particular case, and I think this is important, is you've been given an all or nothing proposition. Either we demolish all 4 of the structures and rebuild, or we have a calamity in terms of an economic hardship. No other alternatives are being presented. No partial redevelopment is being proposed. And in Mr. Palmer's own presentation, he used the term converting to commercial application. Why? These are residential structures. And so he purchases these properties, knows it's in a historic district, and immediately tries to ascertain how to make a commercial application in historically residential buildings. Why? That's not the obligation of this design guideline. That's not how it works. Next page, and Karen Miller will get into this more. These are numbers given by Mr. Palmer himself in terms of what the cost of repairing would be back in 2014 and again in 2019. And then the next demolition criteria, A7 is not met. Next slide, please. And the question here is, would demolition of the historic building weaken the overall integrity of the district and thereby negatively affect the city's special historic value? Well, we know that's the case because when you flip back to the city's statement under A6, they say the construction of the proposed building would leave the Eli Ashby House as the only remaining structure with a single family form along this portion of Grandview Avenue. Yeah, of course. Of course it is weakening the overall integrity of the district. It has removed 3 contributing residential structures, of course. And you will note the comment there that the grounds for removing properties from the National Register are when the property has ceased to meet the criteria for listing in the National Register because the qualities which caused it to originally be listed have been lost or destroyed. There is every reason to believe that this important district can be lost as these buildings are being removed. And again, it should be noted, and I know Karen will mention this again when we're thinking about the waiver criteria. Why should the developer's purchase price of these sites be of concern or consideration to whether or not they can make this work? Nobody forced this developer to buy these properties. Nobody had forced them to do that. They are certainly doing this at their own risk. Next slide, please. Then we have 4 more criteria within the demolition section of the code that are not met. And the first is, what is the assurance that the new project will be completed if demolition occurs? 0. We have 0 assurance. 0 assurance. We have a 5-year track record of a developer who's been purchasing these properties since 2014, and we see the condition of the sites today. We have 0 assurance that if and when these properties are taken down, that project will be built at all. 0 assurance. And all you have to do is look to their own track record. And then B3, whether the improvement has been maintained as provided in this ordinance. And look at the questions that are in front of you. Has the structure been maintained? Is there effectively demolition by neglect? I didn't give you the analysis from 2014 and 2019 in terms of the costs of reconstruction. Mr. Palmer did. And you saw the egregious increase in costs associated with the price of renovation while he owned it. And so I don't know how you put together evidence that's more obvious that there is effectively demolition by neglect and that these properties have not been properly maintained. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. So we dealt with the demolition. If you can get through all of the criteria, if you can find waiver justification, then we get to talk about a new building. And in this particular issue, we didn't want to just put a land use attorney on here to debate an architect. We went to Norrie Winter, who was the architect, the drafter, the consultant of the 2013 design guidelines for Old Town Arvada. And he put together a letter that's in your packet, and I hope that you've all seen that letter. The letter clearly speaks for itself. And what we also did in the last week, because we were, as you know, under a tight time frame between a new submittal, the city council granting a waiver, and then this meeting being scheduled, is we reached back out to Norrie, showed him the new plans, and we said, hey, what new information do you have? And he said, quote, I've reviewed the revised submittal and see no substantial changes that would mitigate the impacts of this project. My previous comments continue to reflect my opinion. So next slide. I'm going to, in the time remaining, just kind of run through a number of the design review criteria that you have to contemplate. And I'm going to run out of time as I'm going through this. And that's kind of the point. There's so many of these that they don't meet that I can't even get it done in all of this time. So first one is 5.1, design a new building to reflect its time while respecting key features of its context. And here, from Nore's letter, the building appears massive and out of scale with the context. Slight variations in materials and wall insets are proposed as a means of reducing scale, but these are superficial in reducing the perceived mass of this building. The 57th Avenue facade is treated as a service area. This violates the design guidelines. The building forms permitted in the code do not include parking structures in this character area. That's an important issue, and that's going to come up again and again and again in the Grand View District, that parking structures are not a permitted building form. Next slide, 5.4, maintain the traditional orientation of a building to the street. Here we have two separate things we're looking at. We're looking at the design guidelines, 5.4, and we're looking at the development code, the zoning code, where it discusses street-facing entrance. So here, his first comment is this project faces two primary streets. However, the proposal completely ignores one of them in terms of complying with the standards and guidelines. The 57th Avenue facade is treated as a service area. Now, the architect just got on here. He showed you an old picture of the project as reviewed and denied by the city council, and then dressed it up, put on some glass treatment, put on some awnings, and I call that fake. There's nothing new that has been changed, that has been activated to 57th Street. There's not one new component of what he dressed up and put on glass and awnings that activates 57th Street any different than the way it was initially designed. In terms of compatibility at the street level, this proposal focuses only on the character of the storefront level on Grandview. Next slide. Maintain the traditional size of buildings as perceived at the street level. Again, Nore, too much of the building is at 3 stories in height. The Grandview character was envisioned to be 2 stories. If any third floor is to be permitted, it should be substantially less. So they get a variance from the Board of Adjustment, which they'll claim gives them the right to do that. And still the point is, it should be substantially less. Just because you have the right to do something doesn't mean you have to violate it to the maximum extent possible. Second, there is no upper story step back in the wall on 57th, with the exception of something on the 3rd level, which clearly doesn't help maintain the traditional size of the buildings perceived at the street level. At the street level, a small setback at the 3rd level for those residential units impacts the building not at all in terms of perception at the street level. Next slide, please. Establish a sense of human scale in the building design. Again, Nore's letter that no backside of a building should face directly onto a street. How do we know it's the backside? All you need to do is go back to the developer's own presentation materials that were submitted for the hearing back in March to the City Council, and they identify that visual impact of parking from Grandview is negated, loaded in the rear off 57th. So the developer himself identified in his presentation materials for the City Council that the rear is on 57th. That hasn't changed. It hasn't changed with a couple of awnings and a little bit of glass. Further, the presentation that was made today is that 3,900 square feet is all the retail you're getting in this project. 38,000 square feet is the size of the building, and 3,900 feet is the retail. But what's significant about the retail on the first level is nearly 7,000 of the square feet on the first level is a parking structure. That's not human scale. Next slide, please. 5.9 is so important that you repeat it as 5.23. It's the same design standard. Next slide, please. 5.27, maintain the distinction between the street level and the upper floor. Again, I identify Noray's letter. This project faces two primary streets, but the proposal completely ignores one of them in terms of complying with the standards and guidelines. And then this is crucially important. In terms of compatibility at the street level, this proposal focuses only on the character of the storefront level on Grandview. This is only a small percentage of the building character that should be addressed. Next slide, please. Buildings oriented to a plaza should invite pedestrian activity. Noray's letter, the entrance to the residential units is not clearly identified. The residential entry is hidden on a side wall and accessed by a narrow walkway that is uninviting. Providing a wider walkway and adding a prominent entry canopy are examples to make it more prominent. And you can also see from the design, from the zoning standards, that street-facing interest is required. And this is tucked back along the side of the building. Further, the primary interest should be oriented to the street or courtyard, and connectivity through the property is not adequately provided. Next slide, please. These next slides are specifically from the Grandview design guidelines from the code. Minimize the visual impacts of all parking areas. This is key. Having structured parking immediately at the sidewalk edge and enclosing it with a blank wall is inappropriate. No backside of a building should face directly onto a street. The building forms permitted in the code do not include parking structures in this character area because none were supposed to be constructed there. As a result, there is no specific guidelines for that building type in Grandview. We can debate all we want about this particular question, but the person who drafted these design guidelines has articulated that these building forms are not permitted in the Grandview area. And here we are dealing with exactly what he knows to be a violation of the code. Service areas should not be directly located on the street. Service doors open directly onto 57th Avenue. Again, this is a major street, not a back alley, and this treatment is inappropriate. And also, as it relates to this criteria, this area is especially important because of the transit-oriented nature of development that was envisioned. On-site parking was to be limited. Having a ground level that is predominantly parking, I gave you the percentage, is contrary to this fundamental concept. Next slide, please. Again, from the Grandview section, provide a pedestrian-friendly ground floor. And again, you see the issues relating specifically to 57th, where they've dressed it up. No doubt they've dressed it up, but it's not the pedestrian-friendly activated frontage that the architect seems to be shaking his head believing it is. The Grandview character area is one of the most cherished places in Arvada, and maintaining its character is especially important as the entry experience for transit riders who disembark here. Next slide, please. 6.29, establish a sense of human scale in a building design. Too much of the building is at 3 stories in height. There is no upper story step back in the wall on 57th Avenue. The building appears massive and out of scale with the context. Again, these are the ways in which Noray Winter has reviewed this particular application. Next slide, please. Maximize the solar access for all properties. Deborah Andrews is going to show a solar study as well in her presentation that will speak to this issue. But clearly, too much of the building's at 3 stories, which is creating a massive solar access problem for this site. And frankly, we don't need to see the what-if scenarios if we built to the maximum bulk plane to then figure out that this is so much better than the what-if scenario. That is offensive that we would identify the maximum bulk and then suggest that we're doing something less, and therefore the solar access is so much improved. Next slide, please. 5.2, maintain traditional spacing patterns between the repetition of uniform building widths along the street. Again, you see Noray's comments that the slight variations in materials do not reduce the scale. Next slide, please. Minimize the impacts to primary views from existing private structures in public ways. You see Noray's comment here as it relates to the park and from St. Anne's School. Next slide, please. Provide a visual buffer along the edge of a parking lot or service area. Again, I am repeating myself, I know, but the building form is not permitted in this area. Next slide, please. 4.21, minimize the visual impacts of service areas. And again, on and on and on. Next slide, please. Why don't we flip ahead to 5.26, if you don't mind. Thank you. So this is where the staff finally says that the waiver criteria, that the criteria is not met. Obviously, then they must assume that the waiver is met because of the purchase price and Mr. Palmer's inability to derive a profit. But remember, each of these criteria require that the waivers are met independently.
Faster, your time's up.
Okay, so the last page I'll just put on here. The last page is our own analysis, of course, of the, if you don't mind just moving to the last page. One more, there, nope. We believe that 47 design guidelines have not been met. And if, in fact, you believe this is a project worth supporting, your waivers need to identify and address each of these 47 design guidelines that are not met. And again, appreciate your time. I know this is a difficult forum to have these conversations, but your staff has done an excellent job of putting it together. Thanks. And we're available for questions as well.
Ms. Pearson, before we move on to anything in the future, I did just want to address one issue for the committee to ensure that you have the information and instruction that you need to move forward with determining a recommendation. As you had indicated up front, Ms. Pearson, the purview of the Design Review Advisory Committee is to provide a recommendation to the director so that he can utilize that in making a determination under the design review guidelines and the waiver criteria. There was some mention of the demolition review criteria and standards. Just for your reference, those are located in Appendix A of the design review guidelines. I do want to point out one thing. As you're reviewing criteria for the demolition, it doesn't matter what order you do this in, you can do it first or second. And here's why it doesn't, the order of your review is not going to matter. If you're looking at page A5 of the Appendix A in the Design Review Guidelines, it does state, however, where applicants do request demolition of a historic structure, the city may delay a demolition request for 90 days and apply the following criteria and standards. The demolition review criteria and standards and the instruction given to you under the design review guidelines only gives permission for the city to delay demolition for up to 90 days. There is no authority under the design review guidelines for the committee to recommend or prohibit the demolition of a structure. So I just want the committee to understand that. You can make a recommendation based on the demolition review criteria and standards, but those standards only state that the city may delay a demolition request for 90 days.
Rachel, may I address that? Rachel, may I address?
So if the committee has questions on that, they can address those questions to you. But that is.
I just want to point out that that's your opinion. That's your interpretation of the code.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, up next we will have some public comment. We are going to start with Roger Drienka. He does have a presentation that we're going to load up here on the screen share. And Lori, is Roger with you? Because I do not have him registered as an attendee.
Yes, he is here. We're together in our house.
Okay, I figured as much. All right, give me 1 second to set the time. And I'm ready to go.
Well, good morning. This is Roger Drienka. I'm a property owner and business owner in the Old Town District. And can we go to the first slide, please, or second slide? If you can determine what house that is, it looks to, there you go. It's the Eli Ashby house. So with a little bit of perseverance and work, you can take a pretty crappy looking house and make it look pretty doggone good. Next slide. This is our carriage house, which at the moment we refurbished the interior. Next slide. That's what the interior of that structure looks like. There again, with a little bit of hard work and a small amount of money, you can create a very usable area. Next slide. Here again is the little house next door to the Eli Ashby house with a little bit of caring and hard work. You can make that even look good. And if you look beyond my mother's space there, you can see the inside of that house was renovated by myself, and it was beautiful. We would have people walk by that house in the summer and just comment, wow, this really looks nice. I'd love to live there. Next slide. This is what they think will make our district perfect, is to plop this giant monstrosity in and just take away all that character that is possible. Ask yourself, does this fit Old Town? Next slide. This is what we have to look at now. The developer was saying that owners will take care of their properties, and that's a real plus for the area. Well, this is a fine example of an owner not taking care of. This doesn't fit either due to the neglect. It doesn't warrant demolition at the cost of damaging the delicate fabric of our historic district. This could be beautified and made a viable business for somebody. Next slide. Going back to potentially renovation can be done to all these structures. It's not out of the question that any of these structures could be refurbished and used for many, many years. Next slide, please. Here again is our carriage house. Next slide.
Roger, your time's up.
Okay, we hope that all the rest of this will go on record and that you can all review this at some point. There are some really great examples of what could be done with the area. Thank you.
Okay. Up next, we have Aubrey Dranka, and she will be sharing a video. Give us a few minutes to get that queued up, please.
Every town in Colorado is faced with at some time or another, balancing growth and new development with preserving history. Arvada is among them, with some of the town's oldest homes at the center of debate. Karen Workman met with a woman who's made it her mission to save what she says is an important piece of the town's history.
You know, when you're here in Old Town Arvada, the signs are literally everywhere. But now some say new plans for development could be taking the old out of Old Town. Everywhere you look, it's old this, old that. And it makes sense when you're in Old Town Arvada.
We are the heart of the city because that's what a historic district is.
For the last 14 years, Lori Dranka has run a clothing store off Grandview, a main road through town. Her building fits the criteria for historic.
The first mayor of Arvada's house, built by Benjamin Wadsworth, in 1874. I mean, that's crazy. You know, that's just so unique.
Next door are two more of the town's oldest buildings. The city says they contribute to the historical district, but they're not historically protected and could soon be a thing of the past.
If you take away history, you can't put it back. There's no way for people to get that experience.
The property owner wants to scrape them to build 3 stories with retail and living space, but needs approval. According to the city, the plan doesn't exceed current height limits, and the final look would have to be approved by a design review board. For longtime community members like Drenka, it's not enough. A better option would be improving what's already in place.
I have worked a lot to be sure that these areas are preserved and that we present ourselves in a way that will reflect our history and the uniqueness of our area. And that's my real concern, is that this could take away from that.
If you want to weigh in on the issue, there is a public hearing tomorrow night. We have all of the information online at cbsdenver.com. In Old Town Arvada, Karen Morfitt covering Colorado First.
Leadville will be.
Aubrey, did you have any other comments?
You might be muted. We can't hear you.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yep. You have 1 minute.
Oh, thank you. Basically, just that I feel that the buildings that are proposed are really not within the city guidelines, and I really feel that that should be looked at a little bit more closely before something's destroyed that we can't ever get back again. I can't tell you how many people that I meet and see on a daily basis in Old Town Arvada, and the greatest charm we have there is our history, which is great for our city and great for our state. And I just hope that we can really review these kinds of projects before we destroy something so delicate and something that we can never regain. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Okay. And next we have Deborah Andrews. Deborah, are you there? You're muted if you're talking.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep, and I'm going to start your time now.
Okay, yeah, I thought I just got booted off. Josie, did you queue up the slides I asked for, or did you, is it the whole thing?
I did my best that I could to get them in the correct order, but all of the slides that you have submitted to me, I did submit to the board.
Right. So anyway, guys, hi, and I'm just gonna really quickly mention I own several of the contributing historic properties in Old Town, and as an architect have had the privilege of renovating them with my husband Steve, and finding great tenants, and we are totally invested in the community, as well as we've had plenty of experience with design review over the years since we became members of the community. And I also had the dubious privilege of sitting on the design review committee for I don't know how long, at least 4 years. So an experience with both design guidelines before Winter and Company engaged in this 3-year public process and after that the revised guidelines were implemented. In case you haven't guessed, I do have strong opinions that this project should not be permitted to go forward. All I'm going to do, my submittal is lengthy. I would hope that you would be able and to make the decision to take the time to fully consider everything that you hear today and to look at what we're not able to review in the space of 3 minutes, obviously. But I will highlight a few things. Part of my packet is a cover sheet that's just explaining each of the, or listing each of the items submitted. And David Foster referred to the letters from History Colorado, CPI, Jeffco, and Nori Winter. And I would think that if you're looking for an authority on what's important for any historic district, that you would sit up and take notice. And I realize that you all didn't have a lot of this information perhaps at your disposal back in August of last year when you were, pretty much given a lot of decisions already made before you had any opportunity to make.
That's time.
Okay.
Okay, next we will have Karen Miller. And Karen Miller, you're up next. You need to unmute your microphone before you start to speak.
Okay, I got it. Good morning, thank you. David already mentioned that I was going to speak to the economic hardship, and I did send in a presentation. I don't know if you have it. But anyways, like David said, it's always been very bothersome to me that the economic hardship argument was just more or less accepted on its face without any deeper analysis, and that aggregate numbers were used to come up with this conclusion that the buildings had to be demolished. They are 3 separate historically contributing buildings, and they should each be looked at individually. I did do some number crunching on each of those. Hopefully you have them, you'll be able to look at them, but one of the things is that the developers' repair numbers, in addition to going up astronomically, as was mentioned, do not reflect any federal or state tax credits that are available. And that's one of the big benefits property owners have in a historic district, are those tax credits. Likely he could get 45% tax credit against cost, and that's what I used in my analysis. I think that that's a significant omission, and I think that that should not have been allowed to go through. In addition, we got an email from IATA yesterday on their facade grant, possibly another 15 grand available per property. But I just want to focus maybe more on 7317 Grandview, because it's pretty pure and simple. He's owned that one for 5 years, and his purchase price of $214 plus his repair estimates minus what I believe he'd get in federal and state tax credits, which do require some work and some timing. He would be able to get his desired 7% return by renting it out at $26.12 a square foot. As a comparison, I own the property at 7403 Grandview. It currently rents for $25.30 a square foot. It'll go up to $26 at the end of the year, and it has no porch, no outside space, parking, etc., as that other house does, and its renovation is 18 years old. My analysis on 7315 suggests that, and I had to do some allocations because those properties were purchased as one purchase. Rents per square foot of 28, a little bit higher, but in renovation, he clearly could increase that square footage. The little house on 57th Street does not look as good. I come up with $40.32, which probably is not really achievable on 57th there, but again, it's his high purchase price that's driving that number. And then finally, one of the things his analysis leaves off is that back half of the 7350.
Your time's up.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, next we'll have Jane Schnabel. Jane, you are on. Make sure that your microphone is unmuted before you start talking. Jane, can you unmute your microphone?
Okay, I didn't hear my name.
Sorry, your minutes or your 3 minutes is starting now.
Okay, I'm just, this could probably sound very discombobulated because I've been taking notes. I've been reading the different papers the last couple of days, and just a few things have popped out at me from the presentations today and the paperwork that was submitted. One item, and it was A6 in some of the different paperwork you have. It says, while the proposed building affects the relationship of the Eli Ashby House, it is compatible with other buildings and the area and the district as a whole. I see in everything that we keep seeing from Keene Palmer and a lot from the city, I don't know about the design review committee, is that we keep overlooking the Eli Ashby House and the effect it's going to have on that. Slide 3 in the presentation from Mr. Palmer, it's very, very misleading. It's a picture that they have superimposed of the Eli Ashby House with the new project, and you basically look at that, and if you know the area, which I have lived here in Old Town for 28 years, and I've said before that going by the Eli Ashby House and going down Grandview, I probably drive that at least 2 to 3 times a day or walk it, whatever. And that picture, they basically have taken off the front yard of the Eli Ashby House and make it look like it's sitting right there at the front of the new project. So you just really need to take a look at some of this stuff. Again, there was comments made, and I believe partly from Nori Winter, that the project has to start again. I question again, and I know when Mr. Palmer went to City Council, was it in May, whenever it was, the City Council said, you're starting the project again. I look at this project, and I think Mr. Winter and Deborah Andrews also said the same thing, and Mr. Foster, this project is not started again. All they've done is taken and it just added a few little tweaks here and there and thought, okay, we're just going to keep the same project. And just basically what I've said in the past, that the height and massing of this project is just totally incompatible with the historic district. And it just, you really need to look at what they're trying to do here and push this massive structure in the system totally incompatible with the historic district. Thank you.
Okay. The next person is going to be Cindy Kreitzer. Hi, Cindy. Can you hear us?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Okay, I'm going to start you in 3 minutes now.
Thank you. My name is Cindy Kreitzer, and I live at 9200 Grandview Avenue. Over the last 8 years as a community advocate, I've closely monitored several Arvada development projects and have not found any developer to be particularly interactive with the citizens. Brick Investments has been an exception. They've made every effort to design and plan a building that adheres to the Land Development Code and specifically the Old Town Design Guidelines, while taking suggestions from citizens and implementing our ideas. In accordance with the design guidelines, this project includes retail space on the ground floor, right at the sidewalk level. Each story above ground level is set back from the level below. There is adequate tenant parking fully enclosed to avoid any negative visual impact. The project provides connectivity among properties. The plans include terraces, patios, and deck space as outdoor amenity space. Although the project consists of 3 stories, the overall building height is within 1.5 feet of the height limit for 2 stories. So that leaves the question of the existing structures. These houses were deemed historically contributing properties in a 1997 historic survey. According to the Old Town Design Guidelines, properties need to maintain historic significance. To achieve that, the property needs to be associated with events that have made a significant contribution, or be associated with the lives of the persons significant in our past, or embody the distinctive characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction, or represent the work of a master or possess high artistic value, or have or may yield information important in prehistory or history. The property must also retain its integrity. In my opinion, these structures do not have any elements of historical significance that are not already better represented by numerous properties within a few blocks of this location. Attempting to rehabilitate these houses would not be cost effective and would not result in preserving any unique historic significance. Protecting the view is absolutely irrelevant because the city has already planning to approve a project right across the street that will be way taller than this one, so it won't really matter that we're protecting the view. I believe that when compared to other recent projects built and planned in and near Old Town, Grandview Station represents a happy medium between old and new, both in design and in mass and scale. I would ask that you recommend approval of this project and allow the developer to move ahead. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Okay, that was our last public comment. We have received written comments between staff and myself, and I've submitted all of the written comments we've received to the board.
Thank you. And I do want to let everyone know that, yes, we have received everything that was submitted and have had time to review everything. So now we'll go to questions from the committee. Will, do you want to start us off?
Sure. It seems to me on the question of the A6, which is on our purview and in our list of items that we are asked to comment upon. That seems to be the real sticking point, is that the properties that are currently there, are we going to allow demolition? Are we going to recommend to allow demolition? And you know, I think from a variance standpoint or a waiver standpoint, it sounds to me that the hardship is the item that's being discussed. So I guess a question I would have is, based on what was presented today, it sounds like one or all of the properties in question sat vacant, or maybe there was one that was occupied, but several of them sat vacant for quite a long time. And I know there's questions about, or there's comments been made about the purchase price. So I guess is there information that suggests that the properties in question, at least the 2 that were unoccupied, that there was some sort of or lack of transaction happening there? I guess from thinking about the economic hardship, if those properties were vacant and nobody was buying them, I guess that the owner came in and purchased them. I guess I'm curious as to why we're questioning the purchase price. And that's a question open to anybody.
Can I answer the whether or not those properties sat vacant, please?
Mm-hmm.
Lori Drinka. They did not sit vacant. They were rented out, all 3 of the houses there. The prior owner that was a personal family friend of Keen Palmer's, the new owner, allowed people to come and go, live there. He had people living from his business in Arvada. He would let them come and stay there. So all 3 houses have been occupied even up to about 1.5 years ago, I believe, or until Keen Palmer made the purchase.
Okay.
This is Keen. Can I comment on that as well?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm trying to get you to see me. First and foremost, the previous owner of the property, Bruce and Tammy Ray, they were not personal friends of mine. I never ever knew those people prior to ever. And you can call Bruce. Prior to being introduced to Bruce, I never met the guy, so it's not a personal friend of mine. That's a rumor trying to get people thinking there's some collusion here. It's simply not true. But let's talk about the purchase price for a minute, because the purchase price is not the issue. It's the condition of the properties when we got involved is the issue. And we don't buy properties based on emotion. We buy them on math. And if we were given these properties and we had to invest the necessary $675,000 that our contractor gave us the estimate for to bring them up to commercial code, we'd have about 2,500 square feet to rent. If we required a 10% economic return, which is reasonable, the 7% that Ms. Miller referred to earlier, that's institutional. We're little private guys. 10% is low. For us to get involved in a high-risk thing, it should be higher. But if we were to invest and we were to require a 10% economic return, we would have to rent those properties for $27 a foot, triple net. The average rents in Old Town last year were $22 a square foot, triple net. So we would have to get a 20% higher than market rent last year with no underlying land costs. And that figures before our current economic reality and retail vacancy that I'm guessing is going to have downward pressure on rents in the Old Town area. So it's not an emotional decision. It's a mathematical decision, and it's not based on the purchase price. It's based on the condition of the properties when we got engaged.
Okay. I guess I would also ask if you could speak to the tax credit question that came up, what kind of impact that has on the proposed development that you're looking at.
I can't, to be honest. Will, was that you asked that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know the tax credit that's available for the development we're looking at. I can say, and going back to Karen Miller's observation, there may be some tax credit available. But again, we rely on the math. And even if it was 7317, whether it was rehabilitated for a commercial or if somebody wanted to come in and rehabilitate it for a residential use, the amount of rents, whether they're residential or commercial, would not justify the cost investment. And we can walk through the math if you'd like, but with or without the tax credits, and again, this is the condition of the property when we came involved. You know, there was a comment earlier about the responsibility of ownership in the first slide of Mr. Foster's presentation, and I question why this responsibility of ownership wasn't enforced over the years, long before we got involved with these properties, before it was too late to turn them around. And I guess I ask all of you as members of the community, because, you know, when we speak to Ron and Body Stat, the owners of breadwinners, these properties have been derelict and have been a problem for them for years now. And, you know, so I think the responsibility of ownership goes long before we got involved and before these properties became in their current condition.
Okay. Thank you. I'll let other committee members ask questions.
Tom?
The only item I have is kind of going back to more of the design aspect going on 57th. I'm more concerned with the scale of that. I know that there's a couple of comments brought up about the Gen engineering building is not necessarily in the district, but I think that it is adjacent to Yeah, and it is on the block facing, and so I'm curious for Brad and Keen, if what is the height on that side compared to the Jan? Also, I know that Brad mentioned in his presentation that there's a stepping back on that side, but in the graphic rendering, there's not really a whole lot of steps. And so so I'm just curious how that is compared to the adjacent 2 stories and other 2-story structures in the district. Again, the rendering shows the middle portion being stepped, but the 2 ends are still reading as 3 stories. That's all I have.
Keen or Brad, can you address that?
Yes, I'll address it. This is John Matthews, and this is something that when we went to the Board of Adjustment was clearly defined as the Gene building is actually close to 35 feet. And when we were looking at the height of this structure, we actually reduced the height to be below the height of the Gene building. We're actually at 33.5 feet. And so that was one of the main points that we made at the Board of Adjustment, that the scale of this building was in fact appropriate if you look at the whole context of the block. I'd further like to add another comment. You know, if you look at the elevation along 57th Street of the Gene building and the new elevation designs that we're proposing, there is no service entrance on 57th anymore on our building. And I would argue that if you looked at our building elevation alongside the Gene building elevation, it's very compatible, both in terms of scale, and actually I would argue that we have probably more detailing in terms of storefront. We would love nothing more than to activate 57th. If the city will just waive the parking requirement, we'll get rid of the parking garage and make the whole ground floor of this building retail. That would be fabulous. But again, there was a parking requirement imposed on this project. Everybody needs to understand that. And secondly, this is a block-to-block site, meaning it goes from Grandview all the way to 57th. So the only way to really access the parking would be logically off of 57th. We couldn't bring it in off of Grandview, and there's no way to bring it in on the sides. And I find it kind of interesting that, you know, the appellant was talking about parking. Well, there's a lot of surface parking in the rear of the adjacent Eli Ashby house. Is it more desirable to see cars parked on the lot, clearly visible, and off the alley behind the Gene building, or to have them contained within a parking structure that has been designed to look like a retail facade as we propose? So anyway, those are my comments. Please understand the design constraints that we were given on this project, but certainly the scale is appropriate. And I would argue that Nori Winter would actually find this project much more appealing that was represented by the appellant, because I'm working with him in the city of Littleton on the development of design guidelines down here. And we've done design in the landmark districts in Denver and a lot of design in downtown Littleton in historic areas. And we're very aware and sensitive to historic structures or new buildings within historic districts. So I think there was a lot of misrepresentations on the appellant's presentation. Thank you.
Could I add something about that John brought up about the parking in the cars in the back of my building?
Go ahead.
Okay, it's just that, well, that property was developed in 1874. So, and that is a carriage house, that space between. We would love to develop that, but we have been tied up. And you can see those in those pictures, the plan for development, but we've been tied up in this mess for so long. I'd also like to retract what I said about King Palmer being a personal family friend. I was only going off of what you told me, Keen, that he was an old family friend several years ago. Thank you.
Fong, you still had a question as far as like the 57th elevation, not all of the third floor was stepped back.
Yes, so I think after that comparison to the gen, I think it's pretty relevant. The rendering didn't show the gen's building in terms of building height, but I think that if it would be a little, you did a really well job on the Granville side in terms of stepping and breaking that. And I'm just curious, the two ends, if you, on the third floor, why could you, and again, this is just a question, why couldn't you just step that to the same face as you did on in the middle portion? That would break it up a little more, even though the gen face is, from street to the roof is in one elevation. I think that since you already start doing that on your building, it would make sense to step the third floor. It would help break that up a little bit too.
I think, that is something that, we would certainly be willing to take a further look at. We do have a stair element in the northwest corner, which presents some issues because of that location, that exiting from the third floor. But I do think, depending on if we were to look at the third floor plate and the design of those residential units, we probably could look at stepping back the third floor further from the Grandview face, or the 57th Street face. I do think that it would be interesting to look at the two north elevations side by side, meaning the Jean building and this building, from the viewpoint across the street, say from St. Anne's School, because I do think if we put those two elevations side by side, you would see they're very compatible in terms of scale, certainly in terms of architectural detailing and massing. And there is a certain challenge when we have to have access to a parking structure because of the parking requirement. However, we have mitigated it significantly from the original design. We got rid of the service door entrance. So there's really no indication at all. And there's other examples of this type of thing. If you look at Old Street, Pearl Street in Platt Park, there's a number of examples. There's an old parking structure, a new parking structure that was put in that has some design elements that tie it more into the block in terms of a retail facade. And we've done that in some other areas as well. But anyway, that's my answer on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Did you have any other questions, Fong?
No, I don't have any more questions. I just one last comment on Grandview is that I think that it's pretty complementary to the more commercial buildings and 2 or 3 properties down to the west. And so, and I think that also that second image that when you guys presented in the beginning, showing the one on Old Town in terms of how that relate to existing more of a residential appearance. And I think that it's a pretty complementary, given that, again, on this side here, that it's very complementary to the two-story commercials or mixed use to the west. And I think that it's also will be well defined, having the station across the street as well. So that's all I have.
Thank you. Pete, do you have questions, comments?
Sure, and thanks everybody on all the presentations. I had a couple of things I wanted to clarify, not only procedurally for the DRC and our bullet points and objectives and scopes of today's hearing or today's meeting in regards to specifically which waivers were previously granted. I know that there's been some discussion in regards to what City Council has done in the past, what the scope of our DRC committee is, and what has subsequently brought everybody back forward in front of the table. And I recognize that previously, when we've got the old information in front of us in regards to the waivers that were granted and which were acceptable to the previous DRC decisions, are we being asked to reevaluate the entirety of the case, or specifically the waivers that were granted on the previous DRC recommendations? And then secondarily to that, I guess this would be a question for I guess both sides, making sure that all the information is out on the table for those of us that don't have the previous decisions from City Council. What information was City Council given in regards to December things being denied and now being re-accepted, so that information can at least be out? And Rachel, thank you very much for kind of popping in on that side too, because I was coming towards your direction as well.
Thank you, Mr. Kazura. So just to give you a little bit of background and really to kind of frame the scope of your discussion, the committee needs to consider what criteria are not met, and to determine if a specific guideline is not met, whether the waiver criteria might be applicable and appropriate under the circumstance. So if you as a committee should determine which guidelines you need to discuss, and if there's issues with whether or not those guidelines are met, and then if they are not met, you would then need to discuss the waiver criteria. So looking back at, you do have some guidance in the staff report. You have heard presentations on various other guidelines that may or may not have been met. You've had that information in your packet. So it's up to the committee to determine which guidelines are or are not have been met, and then to look at that waiver criteria.
Pete, also, this is basically hit the reset button. So we are just starting over and looking at the entire project. Again, as Rachel said, asking questions and making a determination of whether we feel that waivers are justified. And again, our role is advisory only. We cannot, at this level, say that the building can go forward or the existing buildings can be torn down. We are simply advising based on the design review guidelines and whether we feel in those instances a waiver would be justified or not.
Absolutely.
I will add,
sorry, go ahead, Rachel.
Sorry, I apologize, Mr. Kazura. I will add to my previous response that since council made its determination, that determination isn't really applicable or relevant here. You're pressing the reset button as Ms. Pearson has indicated. So you're going to do your review anew.
So in regards to the previous line items that we had in regards to guidelines being met, guidelines not being met, or waivers being justified or unjustified, those are the previous ones from the first round of the application process, and all of those 40 to 70 points that we then see as guidelines being met, justified or not justified, are up for reevaluation on each one of those points for our discussion?
You can choose to do that. You can choose to do that. The staff report, which is what I think you're referring to, that has been, we have done a new analysis, and Jeremiah and Rob, you can jump in here and correct me if I'm wrong, but we did do a new analysis and we had issued a staff report based on the new application. So it would be, I assume anyway, a slightly different analysis than what occurred the first time around.
Ms. Pearson, may I just articulate from Ms. Dranka's position on this issue?
Okay.
Okay, thank you so much. Mr. Kazura, to your point, and you're 100% right, this is a brand new reset, and I'm not sure if you were a part of the committee last August. This is obviously a much different hearing that you're having today than last year, and it's because there are a number of people, including myself, who are participating in this, and I think we needed to take a quick step back and explain why we're having a little bit more robust conversation this year than we did last year. You know, if Ryan were here, I think Ryan would tell you the same thing, and it's been documented through the process that Lori was relying on Ryan letting her know when the DRC was meeting. And in reliance on Lori knowing when the DRC was meeting, she was informing her community. And her community has been quite strong and vocal on this particular issue. So they didn't show up to the DRC last August. So this is clearly a much more robust conversation analyzing, you know, a number of different issues in the design guidelines, as well as having this conversation about the demolition criteria. And I was kind of quick before with Rachel when she was describing the demolition criteria. And I just want to take a quick step back on this because Rachel and I are going to disagree on this. It's not the first time we've disagreed through this process. I respect her review of the code and her analysis, but I just wanted to give you my sense of the code and the analysis. There is
Mr. Foster, is this in response to Mr. Kazura's question? Because Ms. Drienka and you have had your 30 minutes.
Yeah, thanks.
At this point, pursuant to the bylaws of the committee may address questions to a specific individual, and that individual may answer the question. And if the answer goes off of track of the question, then the conversation needs to stop there. So it would be helpful to us, I think, committee, if you all would address your question to a particular, either to the applicant or to staff or to opposition. That would help a lot. Thank you.
Thank you. Pete, so I hope that provided clarification so that, yes, this is starting as brand new, not taking anything else into consideration. We're looking at this as if for the first time. And and also this, I think everyone involved has gone above and beyond in that, in the history of the design review, it's not people have not had an opportunity for a rehearing, but because of the way we're filed, we give notice, and then people show up or don't show up at that point in time. So I think that the rehearing, so to speak, as now, or the brand new, everybody has put a lot of effort into it to make sure that all questions are answered. Do you have other questions regarding the development itself?
I don't have other questions in regards to the development, more so along the lines of the actual areas within the guidelines that are waiver applicable. And I think that making sure that I recognize that this is a very big project. I recognize that its longevity is there. But in addition to that, as we move forward and make appropriate, and in our case, votes in each specific context, are we going to be asked to either vote in favor of adherence to the DRC, or specifically adherence to the DRC with waivers in each individual line item then being addressed? Maybe
So,
that's probably for you, Deb, and if not, Rachel, for a little bit. But each one of the criteria that is not currently met by the DRC, by the applicant for the DRC, does each one of those get its own specific line item for a waiver of generality, or a specific one that would then come to each discussion point?
we traditionally have discussed each point, and if the committee appears to feel the same on a certain, a couple of waivers or whatever, we have voted on those as a group. When we're unsure if there's going to be dissenting opinions, and it's easier when you're in the room together. In this format, we are tending towards voting on things individually. And especially since there's the number is not that great.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Was Matthew able to join us?
He has not joined the meeting yet.
Okay, thank you. Scott, questions, comments, concerns?
Yeah, just a couple. Mr. Palmer, just by curiosity, why did the costs go up so much from 2014 to 2019 on those properties?
Yeah, no problem. So the costs that were presented in those engineering reports were order of magnitude estimates, which are exactly that, they're order of magnitude. So they were not based on a specific costing exercise. Our rates are from a qualified GC based on the actual scope of work and market labor and material rates at the time. And I think more importantly is those cost estimates were for a residential application, which doesn't require everything to be brought up to current code. Bringing all the systems up to commercial use required a significant investment over what they had projected. And many of the upgraded, of the items that had to be upgraded, the major systems to code, were not in that order of magnitude.
Okay, and then I guess the other question would be, well, I guess this is a question for Rachel or Debbie. Can we reference things that were determined that we had asked them to do in the last time it was approved, or do you want me to ask it a different way?
So I think when you're going back, are you talking about when you're determining what waivers might be appropriate here for this new application versus the last time?
I have a question about the buildings being moved, or if someone wanted to move them. And I believe there was, last time we approved it, there was a time frame that had to be advertised or tried to find someone to do that. So I didn't know if I need to basically re-ask that question, or if we can just say, hey, last time you were supposed to do this, what happened with that?
I would re-ask the question, and then you can get the response there. We'll just treat it as a new issue.
Okay. So I guess, Mr. Palmer, has there been thought into finding someone to move those buildings, finding a place to move those buildings to, so we don't lose the historic properties?
Yeah, good question, Scott. If I remember correctly, first of all, we still agree to do that. We have no problem with that. But if I remember correctly, I don't believe it was our responsibility at the time, and correct me if I'm wrong, Debbie, to go out and find somebody to find land, build a foundation, and facilitate the move. That offer remains open. We're happy to do it. Again, we're happy to help subsidize some of the costs. We're not going to go buy land and build a foundation, but as far as moving the structure, but we can't have it open-ended, so we need to have a definitive timeline. I think last time it was 30 days. I would suggest that we put that in place again. And if everyone here can help us find someone who wants to take that job on, I think that'd be great.
Yeah, the condition was that not that you would have to buy the land and do a foundation, but that you would promote or advertise so that people were aware that that is a possibility, that the buildings could be moved, just so that people were aware that that was an option.
Well, we'd be happy to work with this committee and staff and find a way to promote and advertise it if that's something you'd like to see.
And I guess my only request would be is if that were the direction that the community decides to go, that we give some details on how that should be done, just so we can have deliverables. Other than that, I think that's really all the questions I have right now.
Okay, well, anyone else, any further questions? Comments, concerns?
I guess this is Will. I would echo some of the comments that Fong made on the 57th elevation. I note that the new elevation is certainly an improvement over the old elevation. Just looking at the plans, it does seem like there is some opportunity there to some slight modifications to move move that third story back a bit more, which might alleviate some of the community's concerns about the scale of that building along the street. Specifically, that it's a 3-story building versus a 2-story building. I appreciate that the height next to the Gen building is similar, and so in that regard, I think I'm less concerned. But I think given that it is a 3-story building, if that is a variance to the existing standard, I think that might be a fair move to alleviate some of the concern that the community has. I think additionally, the architect mentioned that the parking requirement is driving a lot of what happens along 57th. I'm curious, I don't know if anybody from planning is available to comment on just doing a quick count. It looked like there was like 18 spaces and 14 units. Is there an ability to reduce the number of parking spaces required for the building?
I can address that one. This is Rob. The new code reduced the number or addressed the number of parking spaces that are required for development in Old Town, and that the new code requires 1 space for each residential unit, but not necessarily any parking requirement for commercial space. So they could potentially reduce the number of spaces based on the new LDC.
Dave, you have a quick question?
Yes.
And actually not a question, it is a question to Rob. Being that it's on the light rail, can they reduce to 1 space per unit? As Will mentioned, there's 14 units here, and then maybe we just do a 1-to-1 parking ratio because it is across the street from the light rail station. That might alleviate some parking issue as well as provide more additional rental space from or retail or other uses that could be provided. Thank you.
I believe Rob just said that per the new land development code that they can reduce to 1 unit, 1 space per unit.
Correct.
So Will, do you have specific, something specific in mind regarding the setback where on the 57th on the 3rd floor where it's flush or still articulated? And what are your thoughts further on the parking?
Well, just given the activation comments that were made and the comments that were made by the architect along 57th, if a small shop front was available or was able to be created out of those spaces, that certainly is something I think that would benefit the streetscape along 57th. And if it works with the parking requirements that the city's enforcing, that seems like some low-hanging fruit for the developer to hit. Obviously, parking impacts desirability of units, but to Fong's point, given the location of this project, I think there's a case to be made that the that may be mitigated. The impact of less parking could be mitigated due to the quasi-urban nature of the property. And in terms of the setback, I think I would echo what Fong said, and I think the architect made a comment about there's some rearranging of the stair that could happen. It's a 2-bedroom unit along 57th there, and it stacks, and I certainly am sensitive to the realities of stacking in residential architecture. But if the unit on the 3rd floor could be converted to a 1-bedroom, there potentially is a way to rearrange that space to get the to get a setback there. And that's just off the top of my head. I'm not necessarily trying to redesign the building for the architect or the owner, but it seems like there is an opportunity there to look at how the building could step back. As I mentioned, I think there's ample concern in the community about the scale of that building and how it hits 57th, and that's something that might, I think on Grandview, the stepping back of the building is very successful architecturally, and so maybe something along those lines along the backside could be also accomplished. Yeah, so this is on the parking on the 57th Street side.
So that would address, as far as like the retail, that would also help on the 57th side, like you said, that would address a couple of the concerns in the guidelines. Any other concerns at all or comments, Scott?
Yeah, just a couple things. I mean, obviously we're looking, there's 2 things that we've heard from the public comment, in my opinion, is number one, do all the buildings need to come down? And I think that's important to look at, again, not looking at all of them as one, but they are individual buildings. And I guess the second question I would have for the developers, and just to, if you can answer it as briefly as you can, I mean, the other concern has been the size and the scale. And what challenges did you have, or what made you go to such a large scale, and were there anything that you could have done to try to make it a little bit smaller, or why couldn't you make it any smaller?
Well, I can address that first, and then John Matthews can probably address it in a more articulate fashion. But the overall height and massing of the building is a by right development according to the Old Town Design Guidelines and the Land Development Code. So these were documents that were created years ago with lots of public input. And so what we did, as I stated when I started this presentation, is we went out and we studied the governing documents for the area, the advisory studies, as well as talking to the public. And the message we got clear from the governing documents adopted by the City Council was that this TOD area required more density, more 18-hour community, more retail with residences or offices on the top. And at the same time, we had to accommodate the parking requirements and other requirements in the city code. So the form, the function, the size, the scope, the setbacks, everything was kind of governed by the documents adopted by the city, voted on by the public years ago. John, do you want to add to that?
I would just simply say that, when you talk about reducing the mass in the scale of the building, I mean, certainly we've done that on the Grandview elevation. We've done it now, I believe, on the 57th Street elevation, and maybe there could be further improvements. So what you start talking about is moving in the second and third floors on the side elevations, meaning the east and west elevations. And I think, that would greatly reduce the potential size and marketability of those for sale units, in my opinion. But again, that's really more of a development question and a feasibility question. But you know, obviously anything's possible. When you start offsetting second and third floors, it does add a lot of complexity with regard to waterproofing and structural details. So it adds complexity to the project, significant. And you know, those are things that the developer would really have to weigh the cost benefit of those types of items. So I just think that there would be a lot of discussion in that regard.
Scott, any further questions?
This might be a question for Rob, actually. And so, Rob, if they didn't bring the front of the building all the way out to the sidewalk, would that then changes how they can develop the rest of the property? Is that correct?
Are you muted, Rob?
Sorry, I was trying to respond to a different question. Can you repeat your question?
So if they did not bring the front of their building up to the sidewalk, if it was set back, that puts them in a different, they can't then develop the whole rest of the property. Is that correct? Does that then make it into more of the residential layout where it's a 60-40?
Correct. The intent of the mixed-use building is to pull it up to the street. Yeah.
That's all I have.
Did you want to talk further about the individuality of the different buildings?
What do you mean? Sorry.
As far as like, I know some of the language in the packet has referred to them as a whole, but I believe that when we heard it before and now, we are quite aware that they are individual and separate buildings. But did you have anything further as far as a comment or a concern?
I mean, I from looking at the quotes, I have a hard time thinking that all of those things are needed to bring those buildings up to code. I do know that 7317 was a much better repair than the rest of them. And I think that was part of the reason why we had discussed trying to move them, but it is a big jump for repair costs that I'm just not sure if all that would need to be done. So I'm not sold that they all need to come down, and that I do think that they do contribute to the area, and seeing the percentage of how many residential buildings in the area we would lose with losing all four of those that's a big number.
I'd make a comment on that same lines, twofold. One of which the 7317 building, yes, recently being occupied, and from a developer's point of view, recognizing that owning the entire pass-through lot really does change the scope of your project. Obviously, being very, very cognizant over the last 3 years of how much that impacts the community and how much community opposition as opposed to support is in both sides of that. And recognizing to our developers as well that you guys presented a fantastic proposal for that development, but the scope of the size and scale of the building being correspondent to those three structures is a very different palatable presentation, right? You have 7317, which is a small, recently accessible and rentable property, versus the other three structures, which over the course of the years have fallen into disarray, which definitely lends to your argument of saying the cost prohibitive nature of being able to adequately develop that property. And you guys have that in some of the information here. I think maybe my question for you guys as far as transparency goes is that each of those structures is not being individually considered, and the 7317 building being currently whether or not it is inhabitable or not, what does that do to your price point in regards to making the comparison to, you know, making sure that your 7 to 10% yield is appropriate? But in addition to that, if I don't know if there is a way to adequately quantify monetarily what the difference is in regards to, great, if we drop $650,000 to renovate all these buildings, we're going to need to push it up to $27 or $30 a square foot. Is there a way to give an equivalent, an equal justification for the size, scope, and mass of your project to kind of add a little bit of that transparency? And I don't know if that's helpful or beneficial, and I don't care. I would say more along the lines of, what is that place selling and renting for then? If you're going to use that argument for rehabilitation, how do we adequately compare that to what the new size and scope of the new building is, including the demolition of the other properties?
I can try to address it. I feel like there's a couple questions there between Scott and Peter. And we had individual reports done on each of the 3 properties. So each one stands alone with its own forensic structural engineering reports that describes all the issues with the property. And, you know, I'm not a mechanic, but I can look at a car and say that car looks good, but I don't know what's going on in the engine. And I didn't know what was going on with these properties when we got involved. And that's why we hired experts to come in, and they conclusively said that it's 7317 in particular. They said that they did not believe that the cost to repair it that would yield an economic return. Even though some of the floors still look good and the interior look nice, it's what's going on with the major systems of the properties where the problem was. And I can also say that, you know, that property has no vehicular access to West 57th. So if we were to hang up our shingle and walk away, and somebody else came in and said, I want to keep that property as a little residential rental and develop around it, they'd have to have a curb cut on Grandview for a car to access that residential property. And I know by code that's not allowed. So that's, I mean, there's greater issues than just the economics, but we did evaluate each property and its economic rehabilitation potential separately.
Can I ask you a follow-up question in regards to that? If 7317 was to maintain was to remain as a structure that is a residential inhabitants, upon transition of that sale or reoccupying that space, you'd have to cut the curb to make access?
I think that's a question for city staff.
I can attempt to answer that. And I'll ask one of the attorneys to step in if I put my foot in my mouth. There is currently an access easement across one of the back properties that provides vehicular access to that building. However, once all of those properties come under one ownership, that easement goes away due to a merger of ownership. And that's why I want the attorney to make sure I'm not incorrect there. So if the 7317 was sold off individually and a new easement was not granted, I don't know that we have the authority to force a private property owner to grant an easement upon sale unless it's conditioned on some sort of other development agreement or something like that. And then the new owner came in and they no longer had an easement and requested driveway access. I believe we always have to provide a driveway access for a property. So I believe that technically that is probably a true scenario that could happen.
Does that throw a, does the acquisition of those properties, and I am not unaware of the timing and the ordering of the acquisition, when the city planners look at a property of that nature and then amalgamating a single owner, does that change the property value, the potential, the future development, the historic nature of that 7317 property now that all the properties are currently owned by Mr. Palmer?
Again, I don't have a good answer for that. I don't think so.
Other questions, Pete?
No, I think the only other side of that transparency conversation was the economic feasibility. And I think, and correct me if I am wrong, the criteria that we're talking into in regards to the rehabilitation possibility versus a demolition property, specifically under 8.6, and that only entails the criteria for demolition being an economic hardship. Is that correct? Because as we look at the cost analysis when it comes to the total rentable amount of square footage and the argument made for is it economically feasible to rehabilitate the properties, that is in specifics in regards to the demolition criteria, correct?
It is. I was just rereading that section again because I don't know that that is. I'm going to reread that section. Will, do you have any other questions or comments? While I take
I guess the only thing I was just going to comment on, I think it's difficult for the committee to make a true justification or a true judgment on the nature of the economic hardship. There's evidence presented, based on what we've heard. There seems to be a case that there is an economic hardship to convert these properties from residential to commercial, which seems to be an allowable use. That seems to be an allowable right that the owner of the property would have. I don't know that the historic designation of the property or the district requires that the property remain residential. And that, if the only way that it's economically feasible is if it remains residential, that seems to me to start to get into an economic hardship. But like I said, in terms of evaluating true dollars and cents of the scope of the work, beyond if somebody feels that there's something just egregiously incorrect that's been presented, I think that's, I guess, I don't know how we as a committee make a true determination on that economic hardship is beyond the evidence that's been presented. And that's a comment to the committee.
Appreciate that. Another comment along the lines of the economics. Karen had presented regarding credits that can be obtained. I don't know what, if any, would be available to that project at this point in time. I know when I was renovating one of my buildings, and my building is considered in the same class as these are considered, both of mine are considered contributing but not significant, and not qualifying for the National Register like the Eli Ashby House, but I was not able to get any assistance because of the way my buildings were classified. So I don't know. Again, it's an unknown. We don't know if there would be money available in that fashion or not. Following, any comments or questions along those lines?
Debbie, could I speak to that?
As far as right now, we're just trying to get the questions of the committee out, and so that we can take a look. And then if someone has a specific question, I can have that addressed to you.
Okay.
Fong?
Sorry, I thought I unmuted, but no, I don't have anything to add.
Okay. And just as a reminder, what we're doing is we have to take a look at the entire packet and make the recommendation. And again, it's a recommendation only of our thoughts on the building. We can also, as we have in the past, made suggestions and or conditions such as Will suggested on the number of parking spaces and the 57th elevation setback. And so we will be looking at the three possible waivers on the structure itself, as well as the criterion for total demolition. Are there further questions, or are we ready for a motion on these items? Well, you're usually pretty good at this. Questions, are you ready?
Well, I think what I would say is window spacing pattern. So there, we have three partial waivers that have been identified that we can talk about beyond some of the other things that we talked about. I would say that in terms of the window spacing pattern, which is 5.26 and 5.28, I don't believe this is very similar to what we saw before, and understanding that this is a new submittal to think about. I would just say that based on looking at the project and some of the goals of the project, that that those two items, 5.26 and 5.28, that a waiver would be justified. I would open that up, especially I know Pete wasn't part of the previous conversation, so if he has any questions specific to those. Beyond that, the question about the demolition criteria, 8.6, I guess like I said before, the financial hardship question, I guess beyond, unless there's a significant case to be made that tax credits would negate the concern of the owner from converting it from a residential to a commercial property. I don't know that I've heard anything necessarily today that would suggest to me that the financial hardship does not apply, but that's obviously said based on an incomplete picture of the information. The committee hasn't had a chance to evaluate the structure in itself, and we're just going based on testimony. So that's kind of where I'm standing currently, and I would open that to the rest of the committee for questions or comments.
And your feeling on 6.27 on the 57th?
Right. I mean, I feel like that's a response to some of the concerns that have been raised in the meeting today based on the public's output or the public's input. So that I would add a comment based on that criteria for that. So that would be probably a new comment. I'm not sure how that would work in terms of a waiver, if we would ask for an additional condition of
just more like a comment. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Further comments? Pete, Scott?
I would, in regards to 5.26 and 5.28, recognizing that a waiver would be justified. I echo Will's comment on the 8.6 in regards to context and design for demolition. The economic feasibility of rehabilitation, I think, has to be adequately weighed against the public's obviously emotional and historic nature of the property. So really being able to determine what is economically feasible, whether that be a break-even point or whether that be profitability for the developer, is not our decision. I recognize that, but being able to adequately have reservations in regards to the economic feasibility of the rehabilitation, looking at each of those properties individually, would be a concern of mine.
Fong?
No, I don't have anything else to add. I think I'm in the same line with Will on these 3 points here, as well as the as well as the setbacks. Again, responding to the massing of the overall.
Scott?
I'm pretty much in line as well. The only thing just to add that I've already said is with if the 8.6 is recommended by us, that they should be taken down, that we do make sure that the developer tries to find a home, and we give some details on how we would like that process to happen, or somebody gives some details at some point.
Mm-hmm. What I'm hearing, I'll get the paperwork. Will, would you like to make a motion since you have the kind of like the conditions, I guess we'll call them, or concerns to be reviewed by the Community Development Director on the 57th elevation?
Yeah, I can. I guess actually I have probably maybe just two more quick questions.
Yes.
I guess I would open to the floor for quick responses about experience with tax credits. I just want to make sure that we've kind of closed the loop on that one. So if one or two people that are in attendance have any comments on tax credits and how that could be applied to a renovation of the existing property, I would certainly open the floor to that. I'd love to hear if there's any other comments there. And then the other comment, just to, I guess, to staff would be to my previous comment about if converting this property from a residential to a commercial property is the hardship that we're talking about. My understanding is that from a zoning standpoint, and there's no legal or code issues that would require the owner to maintain the residential nature of this property. So I have two questions. So I think first I would open it to one or two people who are in attendance if they want to make comments about the tax credit possibility. David?
Yeah, thank you. As it relates to the tax credit, we believe that contributing buildings are eligible for state tax credit so long as they are kept as a residential use, but not federal credits. So we believe that there are mechanisms available to this developer to add to his capital stack to keep it as a residential use and get state tax credit for that. And I'm happy to answer your second question if and when you're ready.
Yeah, I guess I'd leave it open if there's anyone else that wanted to respond to the tax credit question.
I do not pretend to be an expert in tax credits, but looking at the state's website, it says the building must be historic, and this means that some authority must designate the building as being historic. And there are 3 levels of designation: local landmarks, which are designated by municipal or county governments. To qualify for those credits, the local government must be a certified local government. We are not on their list of certified local governments. We do not have a local landmark board or anything like that. And then it goes on to talk about if it's on the state register, and it's not, they're not talking about within a historic district, they're talking about the actual building is the way I'm reading this. And then, or they're on the national register. So my reading of this is that from a state perspective, you wouldn't be eligible for tax credits. The national one, it's a little bit more difficult to say. The national one does say if you are a contributing structure in a historic district. I don't know if that only applies to commercial or both residential and commercial. So I don't really want to speak on this on the national other than to say it looks like the national you are eligible if you are a contributing building within a historic district.
And I would just say that I know Deborah Andrews is still on the call. She has a lot more experience on this, and I would ask that we direct the question to her if that's okay with you, Madam Chair.
Deborah, yeah, you can.
She's actually just on the call as an attendee and cannot participate.
Okay.
But she spoke.
One thing just to that point, which again, I think it's going to go to, at this point in time, we're all going to be guessing. As I said earlier, I did try to go through the process and I was denied on both, and mine is a residential structure. Whether or not it would be possible today, you know, the state one in particular, it was exactly what I had been told. And then I cannot remember why I was denied on the national side. I know some people have applied, and I don't know their stories as far as whether they or not they receive credits or not. But again, I think we're going to be making a recommendation without knowing exactly, you know, all of the information on that particular item.
Yeah, I'll read from Deborah Andrews' email. The Davis block is contributing and got state tax credits. Commercial buildings get both. So I don't think we need to wonder if this is possible. She's an expert.
It's a much different building. Will, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think I'd agree with you, Debbie, that it's not conclusive, and I don't know that we can at this point make a determination that by itself would change the math significantly to alleviate the hardship question. So I guess the second question would be that, like I said, to staff, you know, from a use standpoint, is there anything within the city of Arvada that would restrict the owner from the right to modify this property from residential to commercial?
No, it's really just the form. I mean, it could the use is kind of second to the form, so it could be used as both commercial or maintained as a residential in terms of use.
Okay, thanks. So I think Deborah, you mentioned, or Debbie, you mentioned the 6.28 provide a pedestrian-friendly ground floor.
I was actually looking at the 6.27, the setbacks on the 57th. Just if you had anything that you wanted, just because of your comment regarding the setbacks and the also, yeah, it would go into both of those areas as far as whether this building really is compliant in that area. And again, it's a lot of this is perception as far as whether it's compliant or not with the guidelines.
Yeah. Okay, so I think a motion that I would make is that that the committee that as to DA 2020-0053 Grandview Station 7315 and 7317 Grandview Avenue and 7318 West 57th Avenue, the following recommendations be adopted and transmitted to the Community and Economic Development Director, that a partial waiver be granted from design guidelines 5.26 and 5.28, which are window spacing pattern and storefront components, based on compliance with the local, and on page 30 is I'm missing, but based on approximate compliance with the district and not having a negative impact on the overall character of the neighborhood. I would move that a partial waiver be granted on 6.27 and 6.28. Partial setback could correspond to specific building type and context, as well as provide a pedestrian friendly ground floor. That the design look at the possibility of reducing parking on the ground floor to allow small retail spaces to provide activation on 57th, and that the third floor be set back while I acknowledge that that's a use by right from a height standpoint, due to the fact that a waiver was granted at providing for a third floor versus the 2 stories that are required by code, that be a something considered because of concerns within the community. And then additionally, that demolition criteria 8.6, context and design, be a waiver granted or a partial waiver recommended for that criteria based on the determination of financial hardship. And I apologize, I don't have the numbers in front of me to accommodate that. But that would be my motion.
I've got them. We can get those entered. The first one would have been under number 2, and the hardship would be under number 3. I'm going to split those just because they are in different categories.
Okay.
If that's all right with you, Will?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so I'll call each by name, and we will vote on Will's motion first for the building itself. So that is the partial waiver granting for 5.26 and 5.28. Will, how do you vote?
Aye.
Fong?
You're muted, Fong.
Oh, there you go. I'm sorry. No, I have nothing else to add.
What we're now just doing the vote on your vote, aye or nay, on the partial waiver granting for 5.26 and 5.28.
Aye, for those 3 items.
And Pete?
Just to confirm, we're doing 5.26 and 5.28 separately, correct?
We're doing 5.26 and we were doing 5.26 and 28 together, but we can actually do them. Okay. Yeah.
That's totally fine. Aye.
Okay. Scott?
Aye.
Okay. All in favor? We will separately finish Will's motion. His motion was to grant the partial waiver 8.6 for the demolition. And Scott, do you want to phrase that if that recommendation or even if it doesn't, that our recommendation, regardless of the vote, do you want to word what that looks like as far as if it should come to pass, the advertisement of moving the one building?
Is there anyone else on this call, and I'm looking at city staff, who has any thoughts on how that should be worded, just again to make sure that there is a checklist that the developer goes through to ensure that there is public notification? And again, I am not an expert on that. I just want to make sure that we have things that they know they need to do.
Might be muted.
Hang on, bear with us just a minute. I mean, it's obviously a unique case. And the way that we wrote it in the last certificate was, you know, a little bit flexible. It kind of just said that the applicant would work with staff to find essentially a new owner for them in 30 days. So just bear with us a couple of minutes.
Thank you.
Debbie, may I just let you know about a logistics issue that we've had throughout this meeting?
I think with respect to the relocation question, I think we can really just make recommendations anyway, rather than sort of requirements. So maybe while the staff is, yeah, okay, I just wanted to make sure we were all on the same page.
Yeah, we're just trying to decide of you know, how that should that be worded so it's more specific so that there would be no misunderstanding of who would do what by when.
Okay, thank you.
And Debbie, can I ask a question in regards to what I think is coming next in regards to the 8.6? Are we able to make recommendations to view each one of the economic feasibilities of those properties individually, or do they have to be voted on as a unified body?
We can vote on each property individually. Is that your question?
It is. Well, just in regards to the 7317 property being a single residential unit, and then the other three properties, the 7315 and 7318, being a separate entity, right? Because I think if we're going to make sure that we are being clear and transparent in regards to all of these criteria, if we're talking about the economic feasibility of demolition, you're talking about demolishing 4 structures that were acquired in different time periods and that are in different states of conditioning, and I think giving us as the board the appropriate ability to say, is each one of those economically unfeasible of rehabilitation? And again, I don't know how we obtain that information other than the testimony from not only the developer but also from the opposition. So I think that being able to identify that it is appropriate for us to grant a waiver in regards to each of those buildings, as long as they are individually identified and analyzed for feasibility, not as a property developer, but as appropriate information for all of us to have. So my question is in regards to the 7317 building. I think specifically given its occupancy more recently, is there an ability for rehabilitation on that specific property? And what does that market value then do to the feasibility of the development of the entire property? And maybe that's a question for your developer as well, is there an ability to say this project doesn't go unless we scrap all 4, and does the 7317 independently available for economic hardship demolition criteria? And that's one of my concerns when it comes to the criteria for demolition, is that if all 4 buildings are being encompassed into the same lot, does that then give economic hardship and unfeasibility to one of the other properties that was inhabited more recently? And I recognize the 2014 and I think 2017 review of the buildings in regards to their structural integrity as well. So I guess to kind of phrase that in the appropriate senses, does the economic feasibility of demolition of each of those properties stand independently on its own?
Yes. Yeah, we are not looking at them as a whole, and that was why the report on each of the individual buildings. And we can, Will's motion was for all of them, but they can be split out if you would like.
I'd make a motion to see if we can to evaluate the economic feasibility of each of those properties individually.
Okay, so we have that evaluation. Now the determination is, do you want to vote on them individually?
That's what I think. And again, without further data in regards to both both parties being able to give their definition of economic feasibility, and I recognize that that is very subjective based off of which side is giving that proposal. So I would ask that if it's possible, if we are able to say, is a waiver able to be granted for, or is a waiver justified for economic feasibility of rehabilitation on each of those properties? I'm getting from the proposal that this was done in a matter of all four kind of being combined, but if there is an ability to be able to separate those, to be able to say what is the reasonable economic hardships for each one of those properties, I think that that would be fair and transparent.
So Pete, might that be a condition of the partial waiver? Is that an analysis of each property and rentability be provided to the planning department for the planner?
I think that's fair, and yes, I would say if we're going to make that motion to be able to say, instead of incorporating all of them together, I think that a condition of that to be able to say, show me the economic hardship for the properties individually, being able to give a better scope to everyone else who's going to make the decisions on destruction of property, regardless of their historic or contributing nature, more along the lines of the economic feasibility, because that's what we're specifically being asked. Is it as economically feasible to rehabilitate each property?
And we already have the numbers for each property individually. They were part of the report. That's why I was a little confused as to where we were going with this, because we do have the numbers for each property individually as far as what it would cost to rehab them, and that is what those are the numbers that the developer had used in order to say that it was not feasible to do them. That was part of the packet. So each one, if you can find it, Pete, so the Grandview Station mixed use project, each building is done individually in these reports.
No, I recognize that, and I got the review on that. My more pressing concern is that the definition of an economic feasibility hardship is that if you were going to look at each one of these properties, you'd have to be able to take, and this is a conversation for the developer, then you have to take the purchase price and the developing price and the rehabilitation price of each one of those, and then be able to say, if we were to reevaluate the reconstruction and rehabilitation of each one of those properties, do we then need an impact study on that property to say that property is no longer, and again, I think the 7317 building, the acquisition price for $214,000 with a rehabilitation of whatever that may be in regards to the cost, because I don't have the rehabilitation cost per square footage of that house. What does that then do to the project then? And I recognize that in the scope of a 4-point project, that is a significant corner of it, more along the lines of, if we're going to say that it is economically unfeasible to rehabilitate a building, is it individualized to each of the buildings? And I think that's why I would make a suggestion to say, if we can say that is reasonably economically feasible to demolish all these buildings because there's no return on investment on each of them, I don't know. I don't know the transparency behind that, which is why I'm saying, is it possible for us to be able to do that sort of a vote to say, hey, I don't know what the economic feasibility of rehabilitation of 7317 is. So I don't know the answer to that. And again, not trying to not trying to throw anything off here, just more along the lines of, if each one of those is going to be an individual property set up for demolition and has to meet the criteria within the rehabilitation possibilities, is that an avenue worth investigating? And I think it is.
I agree. I'm just wondering, and maybe for clarification from staff or the developer, because the buildings were broken out as far as what they felt that they could get as a return. By building.
can I ask clarification? I have a breakout number that has all the properties. I think the opposition presented a breakout of each individual property, but I apologize. There's a lot of stuff, and I'm having some trouble with Google Drive right now getting to all the records to make sure I can see everything that was presented. But has the owner provided a breakout per property, or is that just something that the opposition provided? It has to be a question to the owner. Mr. Palmer.
Yeah, we did. We provided a breakout, a structural analysis by property to assess what the issues were, and then a cost estimate by property.
That's right. That's right. Okay, I'm remembering now. Like I said, I apologize. I'm having a little trouble navigating through all the paperwork at this point.
So what you were looking for, Pete, is something different than what was on under the heading, is it economically feasible to rehabilitate the properties that they were broken out there, but you're looking at the first kind of lumped them together and then it broke them out separate below. But you're looking for more detail.
And I'm just saying that when we vote on that, is that the ability to utilize the economic feasibility for each property. So I see what you guys are as far as the repair recommendations, but yes, that would be my at least suggestion, to be able to say if we could warrant a vote on each economic feasibility of the properties individually based off of the repair recommendations that the developer.
Okay. Yeah, certainly.
And I would concur with Will. There's a whole lot of paperwork too.
Yeah, I've got it spread out all over. Do we have any suggested language yet from staff?
Yes. Well, we talked briefly, and we thought maybe a letter to both the Arvada Historical Society, the Jefferson County Historical Society, and History Colorado. So we're kind of covering all three levels there, and language in the letter that would make the buildings available for somebody to move off-site. That those agencies respond within 30 days of the date of the letter. And we can require an affidavit of mailing to ensure that those were mailed on time, and along with a copy of the letter and for our records.
Can we also put like a public posting on the properties with that letter, I guess, or something alerting the general public, like, hey, if anybody has property they want to move these buildings to try to save them, let us know.
Looking, seeing if I hear anything from anybody else here. Yeah, does Keen, do you have any opposition to that idea of posting the properties too?
No opposition at all. And going back to, I think it was Peter's question, I'm happy to discuss the per residence economic viability now if you want, or we can submit it in writing to planning. Either way you want to do, I just want to let you know I'm available.
I'm great with the submission. I think that would give good transparency to that. So thanks, Mr. Palmer.
So, Will, would you like to?
Excuse me, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, if the developer is going to be giving information to the planning director to make an independent evaluation after this particular meeting, we won't have that available to have this discussion at this particular meeting. I don't understand how we would be made available, how that information would be made available to us for this exact purpose for this public hearing.
Pete, what what specifically would you like to hear that is not in the reports that we have currently? Just the,
Yeah, I think that,
he has the numbers available.
and I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, the 7317 is the grand total of $69,000 for full rehabilitation. Is that correct?
No.
Sorry about that, then I'm mistaken. I'm looking at PIE Consulting and Engineering, page 7 of 8.
Yeah, that was an order of magnitude bid based without a scope of work, and that was based on a residential conversion, not commercial conversion. So it's certainly not a thorough examination.
So is the residential conversion what you're looking for, Pete? Because the commercial conversion was what Scott was referring to earlier as seeming high on here. It was 265,000.
No, I think my main concern then is, yes, predominantly in regards to residential, that if it's and again, I don't want to get into the dollars amounts of it, more along the lines of economic feasibility of the property. And if I look at the property of 7317 as a independent entity, saying that, is that building in far enough disrepair that it is deemed worthy of demolition based off of the economic feasibility, not of the entire property, but more along the lines of that property. That's one of the things that I'm at least a little bit attuned to at the moment. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Palmer, is the 7317 Grandview evaluation that I'm looking at not $69,500 for the rehabilitation?
Well, that was an order of magnitude given by by PI Engineering, the structural engineering consultant. So it's not a thorough analysis of everything that needs to be done. I can walk you through some rough math, but we got to make some assumptions as a group. If we're willing to do that, I'm happy to. Peter, does that work for you?
That's fine with me.
Okay. So first of all, you have to get over the issue that you'd have to have a curb cut on Grandview. I think that's what the city staff said, because there'd be no vehicular access to 57th. And assuming we can get past that, there's 1,000 rentable square feet in that property. Our cost estimate from a qualified contractor that we know can do the work was $265 to commercial. So we have to make an assumption on what residential would be. We could cut that in half. We could cut it by 2/3. I mean, we can pick numbers and see what each one looks like with the math. But we did purchase that property for $215 a number of years ago. The current market value is more. Mystery Inc. has offered me as much as $350 for it a couple of years ago. We had no intention to sell it. So, a market value is based on what a buyer and seller agree on, but let's say it's $350 or more. Again, broad assumptions here. And say it's $350 or $400 and you're putting another, what's half of $265, $170 into it maybe for residential renovation. Again, broad strokes. You could easily have upwards of $500,000 invested in a residential rental at that location, potentially with no off-street parking if we can get that, if that could be gotten through the city. And you've got 1,000 square feet. So then you're talking about renting a property, again, a moderate 10% return depending on who's buying and renovating. But you're looking to get $50,000 a month return on your investment. So you're looking to rent the property for $450 a square foot or something for a residential single family detached. And the average Old Town residential rent comps for single family detached, 5608 Brentwood rented for $2 a square foot. 5625 Ammons rented for $1.26 a square foot. 7309 West 60th rented for $1.50 a square foot. These are single family detached. So the average is about $1.50, and we're saying we need to get maybe a 3 or 4 times multiple of that to get an average return. And I completely understand this is a better location than some of the other ones. I'm sensitive to that, but the disparity is so great that once again we stand behind the fact that the state of disrepair is so big that there's not a reasonable economic return whether you're going to do a commercial or a residential rehabilitation of that property. Based on a lot of assumptions, I understand.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you. I think I'm okay, Deb, in regards to kind of our motions for, Will, you seem to be our motion guy if it comes to the right verbiage, but, you know, when it comes to the ability to be able to individualize those, but I recognize also that we've been pulling at this for some time. So I appreciate that, Mr. Palmer. Thank you.
Right. So I want to just kind of round up what I heard. I think we talked about one property, and I don't know if it's necessarily the purview of this committee to evaluate specific numbers and bids and to agree or disagree with them. But the maybe just other than just kind of rough order of magnitude and ensuring that there's nothing necessarily egregious within them. So based on what I just heard, and what property was that an evaluation done for?
That's 7318, I believe, right?
Was that the one that you just did the math for, Mr.
No,
Palmer?
it's
No, 7317.
7317.
All right. So I'm presuming, without going through the specific math of each property, that your analysis of the three properties in question, your conclusions are the same for each individual property.
That's correct.
So that if you were to convert them from a residential to a residential, that you feel that there's a financial hardship, and then further, if you were to convert them to a commercial property, that there would be a financial hardship for each individual property.
That's correct.
Okay, and I think I would add, given that the even if residential versus commercial, that in and of itself, if the property was forced to become residential or forced to remain residential, that in and of itself is a bit of a hardship, but that doesn't necessarily need to be voted on here today. So I think I would say that, and I'm going to split it out into three properties. So we have 7317, 7315, and 7318. So we're going to go through three motions here, Pete, to qualify what I think rightfully said was transparency. So it's going to take a little time, but we'll get through it here. So that as to DA 2020-0053 Grandview Station, 7315 Grandview Avenue, the following recommendation be adopted and transmitted to the Community and Economic Development Director, that a partial waiver be granted from design guideline, from demolition criteria A.6, based on the determination that the criteria number, and once again, I can't find my page 30. What was that one again, Deborah?
It's number 3.
Number 3.
Compliance with design guidelines would create an economic hardship such that the cost to strictly comply would result in inability to obtain any reasonable economic return on the property.
Right. So that would be motion for 7315.
Okay, so motion on the floor. Will, how do you vote?
Aye.
Pete?
Aye.
Fong?
Aye.
Scott?
Nay.
1 nay. Will?
That as to DA 2020-0053 Grandview Station, 7317 Grandview Avenue, the following recommendation be adopted and transmitted to the Community and Economic Development Director, that a partial waiver be granted from demolition criteria A.6, context and design, based on the determination that criteria number 3 applies.
Motion on the floor. How do you vote, Will?
Aye.
Pete?
Aye.
Fong?
Aye.
We can't hear you, Fong.
Aye.
Scott?
Nay.
And Will?
That as to DA 2020-0053 Grandview Station, 7318 West 57th Avenue, the following recommendation be adopted and transmitted to the Community Economic Development Director, that a partial waiver be granted from design guidelines, from demolition criteria 8.6, contact and design, based upon a determination that criteria number 3 applies.
And Will, how do you vote?
Aye.
Pete?
Nay.
Fong?
Yes.
And Scott.
Nay.
And should the, do we have the,
Debbie, did you vote on those last two? Did you vote on that one in the prior motion? I think you did a roll call.
the prior,
The current motion and the prior one, I think you took a roll call, but I don't think I heard you vote.
oh, so are you talking about these particular ones or the original one?
No, the ones you're just doing right now.
Okay, the ones that we're just doing right now.
Just to
did
clarify.
not.
Yeah.
7-3, uh, 1-8, West 57th, I, 7315, Grandview Avenue, I, and 7317, Grandview Avenue, nay.
Thank you.
Do we have the verbiage from staff regarding, because once again, this is advisory only. We have no power to make any decisions here. The verbiage, should the demolitions go forth, do we have that verbiage from staff? I did not have a chance to write it down as far as a public posting and the letters to go to the various historical communities.
Yes, we don't have anything exact, but the applicant will send a certified letter to the Arvada Historical Society, the Jefferson County Historical Society, and History Colorado, with the notifying them of the offer for the building, to relocate the buildings, along with a posting on the property on both Grandview and West 57th. And the posting, well, yeah, I think we can keep it generic, just as posting of the property on Grandview and West 57th, and we'll work out the exact language on that posting when we do that.
Thank you.
Can I just hop on a clarification just to make sure I've got my properties right, because I know that there are 3 properties. Correct me if I'm wrong, the property is directly to the east of Eli Ashby is 7317, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and can I just make sure that I confirm my votes in regards to the 3 motions that Will had put forward? The 7315 was a yay, with the 7318 is a yay, and the 7317 is a nay from me.
Thank you.
Appreciate that, thank you.
And then Jake, were we going to have a 30-day limitation on our recommendation regarding relocation activities? How long will the posting be? Okay.
I think 30 days from the date it's sent, mailed.
Okay.
Okay, the other items that we have is the Historical Society has submitted their chosen representative for this committee to City Council. The submission will be reviewed by Council on July 6th. Therefore, I move that we suspend the bylaws with respect to electing officers at this meeting and defer that election to when we have a full committee. Any discussion or questions on that?
No.
Hearing none. Will, how do you vote?
Aye.
Pete?
Aye.
Baum?
Aye.
Scott?
Aye.
Okay, and the motion passes unanimously. Is there anything else from staff or attorneys that we need to address at this time?
Deb, this is Ryan Stachelski. I'm on the, I've been listening. I just want to clarify one thing, and if I misheard this, excuse me, but Will's original motion for the partial waivers, I believe that what he stated was for, and I thought it was like 6.27 and 6.28 related to partial waivers there. But then in the discussion, I heard some conversation about discussing 5.26, which is the windows, and 5.28. And my understanding is, I don't think you ever addressed the staff partial waiver issues of 5.26 and 5.28. I only heard Will's original motion related to the 6.27 and 6.28. And I think that those two got convoluted, and I just want to make sure before we lose you guys that, and maybe I'm confused, but that's where I'm at.
So my understanding, and Will correct me if I'm wrong, so he did say the 5.26 and 5.28, and that those were granted a partial waiver, but then brought up the 6.27 and 6.28 that are currently listed by staff as complying, and he was bringing that up as being a concern and not in strict compliance with the guidelines, and that they look at the setback on the west 57th elevation.
Yeah, I'd say that I think we skipped the formal vote on the 6.27 and 6.28 motion.
Okay.
I was going to mention that. So.
Okay.
Okay, that's fine. So the motions that you made were on 5.26 and the 5.28, and it was just a comment about the 6.27 and the 6.28. But no formal motion on that, and then obviously the A6 motions.
Correct.
Okay, I just wanted to, for clarity, and this is being recorded and we'll go back and look at it afterwards, but I just wanted to make sure that I had a complete understanding.
And just for more clarity from staff or attorney's perspective, since that was a concern on setbacks and the ground floor appearance on the west 57th elevation, should we make that into a motion versus just a comment?
Go ahead, Ryan.
It's fine to be a comment. I mean, we certainly heard the comment. So we can take that into consideration. But I just wanted to clarify to make sure that those other ones were addressed.
Yes.
Thank you. And then, and for the record too, could you do a vote tally? Because the 5.26 and the 5.28, but could you do a vote tally for those three A6 motions just for the record?
I do not have them all written down. Samantha?
Okay. Those.
Or Sarah, sorry.
Yeah, I have those written.
Thank you.
So I can go through that really quick. So for 7315 Grandview Avenue, we had 5 voting yes, 1 voting no, 1 absent. For Grandview Station 7317 Grandview Ave, we had 3 yes, 3 no, 1 absent. And then for Grandview Station 7318 West 57th Avenue, we had 5 yes, 1 no, 1 absent.
Okay, we only have 5 people here.
Yeah.
So.
My apologies. There was one person who was listed.
Right, so.
More than once. Let me go ahead and go back through that.
Thanks.
Okay, so for 7315 Grandview, it was 4 yes, 1 no, 1 absent. 7317 Grandview was 2 yes, 3 no, 1 absent. And then 7318 West 57th was 4 yes, 1 no, 1 absent.
Okay,
That
that sounds right.
Yeah, that's better.
And for the record, I wanted it to be clear just because it's good to recap that. Okay, thank you.
Anything else?
Debbie, could we get on the record that there is not a representative of the Historical Society on just as a matter of
That is already on the record.
Okay, great, thank you.
Anything else from staff?
No, we don't have anything else.
Okay, then we will adjourn.